It began as a meme, a joke, the Kung Fu Panda expansion. But what Mists of Pandaria became was something else entirely. With Classic servers fast approaching, there's no better time to revisit one of World of Warcraft's most misunderstood and ultimately beloved expansions. Back in 2012, WoW ventured into the unknown. With Cataclysm behind us and the world quite literally shattered, Blizzard took a sharp left turn, to a land shrouded in mist, mystery, and controversy. This video is broken into segments, all chaptered and timestamped in the description, so feel free to jump to whatever interests you most. A quick heads up, like with my other retrospectives, I won't be covering PvP. I know Myst is remembered for its incredible PvP scene, and I really wish I could do it justice, but I'm just not an avid PvPer. That said, I'd love for you to tell me your memories in the comments. Let's dive in. I hope you will enjoy. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how Mists of Pandaria began. Almost like a joke, the Kung Fu Panda expansion many called it. But beyond the memes was a story that dared to slow down, to breathe, and to hold a mirror up to the player themselves. After the world-shattering chaos of Cataclysm, Azeroth was restless, and in the wake of a naval battle between the Horde and the Alliance, a storm carried both sides to something unexpected, an uncharted continent cloaked in mist, Pandaria. The factions landed not as explorers, but as invaders. Their conflict ignited on Pandaria's shores, and with it, something ancient awakened. In the cinematic, as two scouts clash in the jungle ruins, a lone Pandaren emerges, not with violence, but with calm strength. His unexpected presence disarms them, both literally and metaphorically. It was the perfect introduction, a moment that captured mystery, humour, and the looming cost of endless war. While the Horde pursued strength through conquest, the Alliance clung to justice and diplomacy. Though not king yet, Anduin Wrynn was a moral leader striving for peace even as conflict escalated. This ideological divide would shape much of Pandaria's story, and the land itself would respond to their choices. Something I miss about World of Warcraft today is how the factions used to walk different paths. These separate campaigns gave the world texture, and if you played both sides, it was enlightening to see how their stories differed and ultimately converged. The Jade Forest would set the stage, a lush, vibrant land quickly poisoned by war. Here, the player witnesses the first signs of the Shah, manifestations of negative emotion awakened by conflict. One of the most haunting moments is inside the Temple of the Jade Serpent, where the Shah of Doubt emerges, warping the temple's sacred scrolls and endangering Yulon's spirit. It wasn't a cinematic, but it felt like one. From the beginning of our journey, we were guided by Lorewalker Cho, a gentle historian who saw stories not just as entertainment, but as wisdom. Through his eyes, Pandaria wasn't just geography, it was a living story, and we were the ink. The Alliance, led by Captain Taylor, crashed alongside the eastern coast. Their priority: regroup, push back the Horde, and secure a foothold. But Prince Anduin Wrynn went missing in the crash. He was found alive, rescued by Ren Whitepaw and his daughter Lena, who offered him warmth and safety. Unlike his fellow commanders, Anduin didn't see Pandaria as a battlefield, but as a teacher. After being healed by Ren's family, Anduin became determined to uncover the healing secrets of the sacred pools and the Veil of Eternal Blossoms. Even when SI-7 agents arrived to return him home, he refused, choosing instead to study the land's restorative powers. Using his mind control abilities, he escaped their custody. Meanwhile, the Horde made landfall on the western coast. Under Garrosh Hellscream's orders, they allied with the Hosen, wild, impulsive forest dwellers. Led by General Nazgrim and accompanied by G. Firepaw, they quickly militarized the region and began building Grukin Hold into a forward base. Both factions saw Pandaria as a strategic prize, and both ignored the warnings of their Pandaren guides. Near the centre of the forest, their clash erupted at the Serpent's Heart, a monument meant to honour Pandaria's guardian spirit. The raw violence of that battle tore open the earth, the statue shattered, and from it poured darkness, hatred, fear, doubt, given form. These were the Shah, and the war had fed them well. Prior to this, Anduin had been captured and brought to Grukin Hill, but during the chaos at Serpent's Heart, he managed to escape. The fallout was severe. Hosen, Jinyu, and soldiers alike fell to corruption. The Temple of the Jade Serpent, once a place of peace, was overwhelmed by doubt. It became clear, Pandaria was not just a land, It was a mirror, and it remembered everything we brought with us. By the time we left the Jade Forest, one truth stood out. The greatest threat wasn't the enemy, it was ourselves. After that emotional wait, Pandaria gave us something unexpected: peace. The Valley of the Four Winds was a golden retreat, farmlands, rolling hills, and sleepy villages. For a moment, the war faded, and we were swept into stories about food, family, and tradition. At the heart of it all was Chen Stormstout, the same brew-loving Pandaren you might remember from Rexar's campaign in the Frozen Throne. That's right, Pandaren existed long before Mists of Pandaria, so get out of here with that. Chen was joined by his energetic niece Lily as they set out on a journey across the Valley of the Four Winds. For Chen, it was a chance to reconnect with his family's roots and learn what had become of the Stormstout Brewery, his family's ancestral home. For Lily, it was a thrill of discovery and a chance to explore a homeland she'd only heard stories about. Along the way, we meet local characters like Mudmug, a laid-back brewmaster whose peculiar wisdom and easygoing nature perfectly captured the valley's charm. His simple joys, rice wine, rivers, and friends, offered a counterpoint to the world's growing chaos. In many ways, Mudmug reminded us why this land was worth protecting. One of the standout moments comes not in battle, but in memory. In the scenario quest Broken Dreams, players step into Chen's past as he recounts the day he returned to the Stormstout Brewery. What he found wasn't a warm welcome, but rejection. His distant relative Uncle Gao, now the self-appointed steward of the brewery, shunned him simply for bearing the Stormstout name. Gao's bitterness ran deeper than Chen expected, and his brewing efforts had left the once proud brewery overrun and neglected. The experience is laced with family tension and quiet heartbreak. Even in a valley known for its peace, pride, and legacy could still divide blood. Yet once the dust had cleared and the family brewery was back in good hands, Gao's bitterness began to fade. He shared stories of the family's roots, pointed Chen and Lily toward their ancestral shrine, and even joined Chen in brewing new ales. For Chen, it was a sobering reminder that coming home isn't always comforting, but healing can still follow confrontation. And for players, it added emotional depth to a story that up to that point had felt light and carefree. The valley also introduced the tillers, humble farmers reclaiming their land one patch of soil at a time. But the serenity of the valley was soon shattered. The once peaceful serpent spine, a symbol of the land's isolation, was breached. The Mantid, an ancient race of insectoid creatures, launched a full-scale assault, flooding the valley with their destructive presence. The collapse of the wall marked the first true moment of urgency in the valley. What was once a retreat into calmness and tradition was now a battleground. The Mantid invasion represented the external threat that was slowly creeping into Pandaria, and the valley was no exception. As the Mantid pushed further into the land, it forced players alongside Chen, Lily, and the rest of the Pandaren to rise up in defense. The peaceful farming life they had embraced was no longer enough to hold back the tide of war. In many ways, this event was a stark reminder that the looming war and its consequences were never truly far away, even in the idyllic landscapes of Pandaria. It also served to deepen the stakes of the valley. What was once about personal exploration and family connection now involved defending the land and its people from a truly primal force. And just as quickly as the storm had arrived, it faded. The Mantid forces were driven back, the serpent's spine was repaired, and the valley's peaceful pace slowly returned. But the damage was done, not just to the wall, but to the illusion that Pandaria could remain untouched by the chaos of the outside world. In the end, the Valley of the Four Winds wasn't just about farming and finding peace. It was about resilience, the resilience of its people, its land, and even its enemies. After the heartbreak of the Jade Forest and the warmth of the valley, peace felt possible. But just south of those golden fields, the drums of war grew louder. In Krasarang Wilds, the tone shifted. The lush jungle became a staging ground, the Horde and the Alliance establishing beachheads, digging trenches, and preparing for open war. Where the valley showed what was worth protecting, Krasarang reminded us how quickly it could all be lost. This was the quiet before escalation, the moment Pandaria began to brace for the storm. As the fighting intensified, players pushed deeper into Pandaria's rugged heartlands, where tradition and turmoil intertwined. Further north lies Kunlai Summit, a land of mountains, monasteries, and old traditions. Here, the war slows, replaced by reflection, trials, and spiritual awakening. players climb towards the snowy peaks, passing scattered villages and remote temples, witnessing signs of lingering Shar corruption and unrest among the displaced Yongle, nomadic tribes driven eastward by Mantid aggression. These encounters reveal how Pandaria's balance is unravelling, and how the player's arrival is part of a much larger storm. At the Temple of the White Tiger, players face a sacred trial before Shen, one of the 4 August Celestials, to earn passage to the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. Prince Anduin briefly appears here too, accompanied by Sunwalker Dezko, reinforcing his quiet commitment to peace and foreshadowing the role he'll play in the chapters ahead. It's here that whispers of Pandaria's deeper legacy begin to surface. The tale of Emperor Xiaohao, the last ruler of a united Pandaria. Long ago, Xiaohao undertook his own spiritual journey across these peaks, seeking to purge himself of anger, doubt, fear, and pride. His story wasn't just legend, it was prophecy, a warning, and a mirror. In the face of war, his example offered a quieter path, that true strength comes not from conquest, but from clarity. The story descends into the war-torn valleys of the Townlong Steppes, a land shaped by conflict and shadow. Once hidden behind the Serpent's Spine, this region marks a turning point where Pandaria's internal struggles collide with outside invasion. Townlong is home to the Shadowpan, Pandaria's elite defenders, stoic warriors who've guarded the land against invaders and inner darkness for generations. When players arrive, the Shadowpan are under siege, pushed to their limits by Mantid incursions fueled by the Shah of Fear. We step into their world at its lowest point, and help them begin to rise again. Though the Shadowpan Monastery is technically in Kunlai, its story resonates here. In the dungeon, players confront the Shah of Violence and witness how even the most disciplined minds have been poisoned. Cleansing the monastery was a reminder that even the strongest can break. Taran Zu, leader of the Shadowpan, wrestles with that burden. He stands as one of Pandaria's most compelling figures, haunted, hardened, but never broken. His arc, from measured control to near collapse and back again, is one of Mists of Pandaria's emotional anchors. While we're in Townlong, we also take on the Shah of Hatred. It's been messing with the minds of the Pandaren, turning them against each other. We step in and put a stop to it. By the time we leave Townlong, the war feels closer. We've seen how deeply fear and hatred have taken root, and how thin the line is between protector and monster. The struggle continues into the Dread Wastes. As players venture deeper into Pandaria, the journey takes a dark turn into a harsh, unforgiving landscape consumed by shadow and fear. Once the proud heartland of the Mantid Empire, it's now fractured by civil war, a kingdom devoured from within. The Shah of Fear looms large here, its influence twisting minds, breeding paranoia, and driving the Mantid to madness. What was once order has become chaos, and the land itself feels hostile. The player quickly realises that the true battle isn't between the Horde and the Alliance anymore, it's against the darkness consuming Pandaria itself. At the heart of this turmoil is Kilrook the Wind Reaver, a disgraced Mantid warrior who refuses to bow to the madness. Through a series of quests and cutscenes, players witness his personal struggle for redemption and his determination to restore honour to his people. As the rebellion gains traction, players join forces with the Mantid resistance, confronting not just corrupted creatures, but the trauma and fear that fuel their downfall. The campaign to reclaim the Mantid capital is a turning point, showing that even in the bleakest corners, hope still lingers. Cutscenes and quest moments reinforce the zone's heavy themes: fear, sacrifice, and the fragility of hope. And just beyond the desolation lies the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, a place once untouched, now next in line. Once a serene land watched over by the August Celestials, its ancient temples now bear the scars of war and corruption. Amid the fighting, the Shah of Fear spreads its corruption. In the Terrace of Endless Spring Raid, players confront this lingering darkness. Within this turmoil, tension between key figures grow. Prince Anduin Rin stands for peace and diplomacy, striving to guide the world towards compassion. His idealism directly opposes Garrosh Hellscream, whose ruthless ambition drives him to harness the Shah's power, escalating the war and destabilising even his own horde. Here, all paths begin to converge, and the full cost of the conflict becomes clear. Meanwhile, a shadow moves behind the scenes: Rathian, the Black Prince. Through a secretive questline that spans the entire expansion, he recruits the player to aid in forging a legendary cloak, not for himself, but as a weapon for what's coming next. His trials pushed the player to their limits, slaying powerful foes, gathering Titan artifacts, and proving their worth as Azeroth's future protector. Rathian's cryptic visions and final warnings made one thing clear: Pandaria was just the beginning. A greater storm was coming, one that would eventually take shape in the Legion expansion. With the discovery of Pandaria still fresh, patch 5.1 Landfall escalated the conflict into a cold war of sabotage, spycraft, and strategic escalation. It introduced Operation Shield Wall and the Dominance Offensive, faction-specific stories told through daily quest hubs. Each day felt like a new chapter in an unfolding arms race. Players uncovered assassination plots, sabotage missions, and espionage reports, giving the war a sense of constant momentum. Much of this chapter centres on the Horde's bold offensive. Under Garrosh Hellscream, the Horde launches an aggressive campaign to seize control of Pandaria's wilds, expanding their reach with new forward bases along the southern coast. Garrosh's iron will and refusal to negotiate set a tone of relentless conquest. The Alliance, meanwhile, plays a reactive role, digging in to defend their footholds and uncover the scope of Garrosh's ambitions. While this patch leans more heavily into the Horde's narrative, the tension between factions becomes undeniable, foreshadowing the war to come. But while the factions fight for ground, something older and far more dangerous stirs in the mists. The Isle of Thunder, long shrouded in storms and sealed away, emerges in patch 5.2. Once the seat of Shen, the Thunder King, its ruins crackle with ancient Mogu power. Now resurrected, Shen seeks to reclaim his empire and enslave all of Pandaria. Players land on the island amidst the crashing waves and lightning-filled skies. Unlike many patch zones, players don't just watch events unfold, they push the campaign forward. Daily quests evolve with progress, Lorewalker Cho guides players through Pandaria's forgotten history, and slowly, the full story of Shen and the Mogu is revealed. At the heart of this conflict is the Throne of Thunder raid, a sprawling, stormlit gauntlet where players face Shen and his generals. The battles are fierce, but the real impact lies in what the Thunder King represents: a return to authoritarian rule, unchecked power, and the ancient evils that Pandaria tried to bury. Hidden deep within the raid lies a secret encounter, Ra-Den, a mysterious guardian bound by the Titans. His appearance hinted at ancient Titan secrets, a glimpse beyond Pandaria's borders, and a reminder that this story was part of something far greater. Though not central to the main plot, Ra-Den adds a sense of scale and mystery that elevates the entire raid. Through quests and exploration, players piece together the Mogu's brutal legacy, their creation, their rebellion, and the dark truths Shen hopes to restore. Patch 5.2 doesn't just deepen Pandaria's lore, it warns us that the greatest threats aren't always the ones marching under banners. Throughout these events, Rathian continues to guide players behind the scenes. His questline runs parallel to the Thunder King campaign, hinting at greater cosmic forces and a looming destiny for Azeroth. But the rising conflict was only a prelude. The chaos within the Horde was about to boil over. As rebellion sparked into open war, Anduin Wryn's role as a symbol of peace became more important than ever. When Garrosh discovered the Divine Bell, an ancient Mogu artifact said to amplify pride and rage, he saw a chance to forge a stronger, more merciless Horde. Anduin stood in his way. Their confrontation in Kunlai became a turning point. Garrosh's pride led to the Bell's destruction, with Anduin nearly dying in the process. For Vol'jin, rebellion wasn't political, it was personal. During the Horde's campaign in Krasarang Wilds, Garrosh, increasingly paranoid, sent Vol'jin on a mission into dangerous territory. It was a trap. Kor'kron assassins ambushed him under direct orders. Left for dead, Vol'jin was rescued in secret by Chen Stormstout and the Shadowpan. When he returned, it wasn't as a general, but as a rebel. He liberated the Echo Isles, reclaimed Razor Hill, and ignited a movement that quickly spread. The Darkspear Rebellion became a rallying cry for the rest of the Horde. Lor'themar, Bane, even Orcish clans began to question Garrosh's rule. The Gob Squad would also join Vol'jin, proof that discontent ran deep. With the Horde fractured, King Varian Wrynn saw an opening. Though cautious, the Alliance offered covert support, espionage, sabotage, disruption. As the rebellion spread, Garrosh doubled down. He fortified Orgrimmar, empowered the Kor'kron, and purged dissent with brutality. Pride had become paranoia. The Barons erupted. In the Battlefield Barons World event, players cut supply lines, sabotaged warbands, and fueled the uprising. The world was hurtling towards a final reckoning, and Garrosh was ready. Deep in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, he unearthed a grotesque relic, the Heart of Y'Shaarj, a remnant of an old god. It pulsed with malevolent power. Taranzu, Pandaria's moral voice, condemned him, called it desecration, but Garrosh saw only strength. The Vale, once serene, was defiled, its waters blackened, its temples twisted. This was the point of no return. The final blow was coming, and it would come from both sides. The Alliance and the Darkspear Rebellion stood at the gates of Orgrimmar, not as allies, but as survivors of the same betrayal. Orgrimmar had become a fortress. Garrosh had dug beneath Ragefire Chasm, carving a dark empire around the heart of Y'Shaarj. Players stormed the city through Kor'kron warbands, twisted war machines, and horrors wrought by the Heart's power. Even former allies stood in the way. General Nazgrim, still loyal to the Horde's ideals, fell with honour. After defeating the Shah of Pride, one detail stood out. Gorehowl, Garrosh's axe, lay abandoned. He wasn't following Grom's path anymore. He had rejected it. Garrosh now wielded Zalato, a corrupted echo of Gorehowl born from the Heart's madness. As players descended deeper, the grotesque scale of Garrosh's vision came into focus. This wasn't politics, it was madness. The Paragon of the Klaxi, ancient allies, joined Garrosh, pledging themselves to Y'Shaarj. They didn't join him out of madness, but admiration. In Garrosh they saw not a tyrant, but a kindred spirit. The final battle was brutal. Empowered by the Heart, Garrosh fought with fury, not to win, but to reshape the world. And he lost. Broken and beaten, Garrosh lay before Thrall, who raised Doomhammer to end it, but Varian Rin stopped him. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice. Jaina called for the dismantling of the Horde. Anduin pleaded for peace. Taranzu, wounded but resolute, insisted Garrosh be judged, not slain. And so both factions agreed Garrosh would stand trial, in Pandaria. But there was one more surprise. The Horde needed a new war chief, and Thrall didn't reclaim the mantle. He knelt before Vol'jin. A troll, a rebel, a leader of the broken. Vol'jin became the first non-orc war chief, a sign that the Horde could change, but also that it had much to heal. The Vale remained scarred, the world shaken. The war was over, but the wounds would take far longer to fade. At the Temple of the White Tiger, Garrosh stood trial before the August Celestials. Horde and Alliance heroes bore witness. Justice, not vengeance, was the goal. And then came the twist. On the Timeless Isle, a land where time bends and destiny frays, Rathian and Kairos Dormu intervened. Garrosh escaped, vanishing into an alternate Draenor. And as one tyrant slipped through time, another soul found peace. Emperor Xiaohao, long gone, finally let go. His spirit dissolved into mist, the last breath of a land that had fought to stay whole. One ruler had embraced pride, the other had learned to let go. In the aftermath, Lorewalker Cho offered his final reflection. His words were not about conquest or power or even victory. They were about stories, and the choices we leave behind. The war was over, but the next was already being written. I'm not the best storyteller, so consider this my personal retelling of Mists of Pandaria. I tried my best to capture the heart of the expansion, but no doubt there is things that I've missed. If you want a full lore deep dive, I've linked Nobble's fantastic video in the description. Many saw the Kung Fu Panda comparisons as a bit of a joke when the expansion was first revealed, which led to skepticism about its tone. But beneath the surface level memes was something much deeper. Mists of Pandaria wasn't about a cosmic threat. It slowed things down, made us reflect, and told a story about saving ourselves, not the world. At the heart of the expansion were the Shah, physical manifestations of negative emotions like fear, anger, doubt, and despair. These weren't just monsters to fight, they were mirrors, symbols of the internal battles both Pandaria and its invaders had to face. Every corrupted zone, every moment of emotional unrest reinforced one of the expansion's central themes, that power without balance leads to ruin. That unchecked emotion, even in heroes, can breed devastation. Taranzu, the leader of the Shadowpan, was the ever-present voice of caution. Someone who saw early on the damage the Alliance and Horde were bringing to Pandaria's fragile balance. His presence grounded the expansion's themes in character-driven moments, reminding us that restraint was just as heroic as action. But Mists of Pandaria wasn't just a story about internal battles and personal growth. it was also a story about a larger conflict, the faction war. Unlike the often straightforward and heavily politicised wars in later expansions, the faction conflict in Mists was nuanced and emotionally charged, and for me, it was the best they've ever done it. It portrayed the Horde and the Alliance not simply as enemies, but as two sides grappling with their own pride, honour, and scars from past wars. This faction war added emotional weight and complexity to the expansion's narrative. It wasn't just about conquering land or defeating a common enemy, but about understanding the cost of endless conflict and the struggle to find balance, both within and between factions. It showed how faction pride, when taken to extremes, could lead to destruction and tragedy. Mists also gave us great new characters. The wise narrator and guide Lore Walker Cho, the tale of Emperor Xiaohao, which was told through Blizzard's stunning animated shorts. That was more than just lore. It was a philosophical roadmap, one man confronting and overcoming his inner darkness to protect his people. And of course, Lei Shen, the Thunder King, who served as one of the best original villains Blizzard has ever created. Proud, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective. Even Garrosh, who had been simmering in previous expansions, reached his boiling point here. His downfall wasn't a surprise twist. It was the logical, horrifying consequence of everything we'd seen from him since Wrath of the Lich King. And that's what makes this story so compelling. Garrosh wasn't corrupted by some dark magic or outside influence. He was the corruption. His arc was a brutal lesson in pride, power, and what happens when a faction puts victory above honour. In the end, the final boss of Mists of Pandaria wasn't an old god, or a titan, or a cosmic horror. It was us. Our aggression, our hubris, our refusal to listen. We arrived in Pandaria as conquerors, we left as something else. Humble, wiser, and scarred by the cost of war. In retrospect, this expansion stands as one of the boldest narrative pivots that WoW has ever made. It was the first time Blizzard moved away from familiar lore heavyweights to introduce something new, philosophical, and deeply reflective. And it worked. Even if not everyone appreciated it at the time, the legacy it left behind speaks volumes. If you've enjoyed this video so far, there's a playlist on screen of my retrospectives you can check out if you're interested. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel, and it lets you know when the next deep dive goes live. Thank you for watching and your support, and let's finally get into this. Okay, let's address the elephant, or should I say, the Kung Fu Panda in the room. Yes, the Pandaren looked cuddly. Yes, Kung Fu Panda had come out a few years earlier. And yes, some players wrote off the whole expansion because of it. But once you got past the surface level meme, the Pandaren was so much more than just a joke race. One of the most fascinating things about them was that they were a neutral race. This had never been done before. When you made a Pandaren character, you started in their own unique zone, the Wandering Isle, and only chose your allegiance to the Alliance or Horde after completing the intro experience. The Pandaren also felt rich in culture and lore. Their philosophies, architecture and attitude offered a peaceful contrast to the constant war that usually defined WoW. And their story wasn't about world-ending doom at first. It was about balance, internal conflict, and rediscovery. That slower, more reflective tone was something WoW hadn't really done before, and I think Blizzard deserve a lot of praise for that. While the expansion wore its Eastern influences on its sleeve, it never felt like parody. The Pandaren were rooted in a believable culture, and that grounded them in the world, even as they brought something totally new to it. And then we have the Monk class. The Monk was the first new class since Death Knights in Wrath of the Lich King. Monks were light on their feet, focusing on mobility, fluid combat, and chi-based resource management. Monks were also the first class to fully integrate a 3-role system from the start that was actually viable. Brewmaster for tanking, Mistweaver for healing, and Windwalker for DPS. Brewmasters used stagger mechanics to delay and manage damage rather than block or soak it. Mistweavers blurred the lines between caster and melee healer, with fist weaving being a unique and polarising playstyle, and Windwalkers brought fast-paced, combo-driven DPS that felt more like a fighting game than a traditional WoW spec. Monks were a bit underplayed at launch, mainly because they started at level 1 instead of jumping in like Death Knights, but those who gave them a shot found a class that was smooth, expressive, and deeply satisfying to master. Blizzard didn't just nail the new class, they nailed every class, and for once you could actually play what you loved without being punished for it. So let's talk about class design. Class design is one of the highest highs of Mists of Pandaria. In many expansions, both before and after Mists, there were often clearly dead specs within the game, ones that maybe you would use for leveling or just a bit of fun, but never in anything serious. In Mists of Pandaria, every spec was viable, in both PvE and PvP. This led to a rare sense in the game where you could actually play what you enjoyed without feeling punished. Each spec had identity and flavour. Shadow Priests felt like twisted Voidcasters, Elemental Shamans had a thunderous flashy feel, and Warlocks, especially with the new resource systems, felt complex and powerful. Blizzard struck a very good balance between making specs feel distinct while still giving all classes tools they needed. Interrupts, defensives, mobility and so on. Specs generally had tight, well-tuned rotations or priority systems. Many had satisfying proc mechanics, for example Chaos Bolt windows for Warlocks and Hot Streak for Fire Mages. Abilities synergized well without relying on excessive randomness, and cooldowns felt powerful and purposeful. I would probably say it was the last complex era before pruning began. After Mists of Pandaria, Warlords of Draenor began the ability pruning era, simplifying rotations and removing niche spells, but Warlords is a video for another time. For many, Mists of Pandaria represented the last time that classes felt full, complex, and rewarding to master without feeling bloated. Moving into the talents, the Mists of Pandaria talent system was innovating, but it definitely wasn't loved at launch. Blizzard completely overhauled the talent system. Instead of the traditional trees that offered tons of incremental stat boosts and ability ranks, this system was a streamlined setup. One talent choice every 15 levels, with each row offering 3 distinct options that usually focused on utility, crowd control, movement, or survivability. For some players, it was a breath of fresh air. It stripped away the illusion of choice that had plagued the old system, and I think this is even clearer after seeing Classic WoW. In previous expansions, there would usually be 1 or 2 air quotes correct builds per spec, and the rest were either flavour picks or essentially traps for the uninformed. MOP systems would narrow things down to meaningful decisions. You could switch talents depending on the raid encounter or your PvP composition, or just how you preferred to play. But like most things in life, not everybody agreed, of course. To some players, the new system felt too simplified. Progression stopped feeling important. This new system, whilst cleaner, was also smaller. It was less like a tree and more like a menu, and for long-time WoW players, it didn't feel right. It removed that RPG layer of tweaking your build, of planning your spec out at level 10 and slowly shaping it into something powerful. In a way, this change symbolised a broader design shift that defined Mists of Pandaria, one that favoured clarity and gameplay depth over nostalgic complexity. Mists of Pandaria's talent tree may be remembered as one of the best iterations Blizzard has made, at least in the eyes of the high-end players and theory crafters, but it wasn't universally praised when it arrived. Some players saw it as a loss of identity and a step towards a more homogenised, streamlined WoW. Other players saw it as the first time the game finally gave players real choices. Looking back, it might just be both. We'll start with the Pandaren starting zone, the Wandering Isle. Nestled in the vast ocean, drifting through the waters of Azeroth on the back of a giant turtle, this place was unlike anything players had experienced before. The Wandering Isle was serene. It was a gentle, inviting introduction to Pandaria, filled with wonder and the promise of adventure. Players learned about the Pandaran's balance between discipline and freedom. They trained under the watchful eyes of the Elders, and eventually, they were given a chance to join either the Horde or the Alliance, depending on their path. It was a choice that felt meaningful. The Pandaren weren't just joining factions, they were deciding how to help a world at war. The Wandering Isle also set the tone for Mists of Pandaria's approach to storytelling. Rather than throw players into the deep end with complex plots and world-ending threats, it let them ease in, to feel connected to the world, and understand the stakes in their own time. There was a sense of belonging in that place, something that was echoed throughout the rest of the expansion. When players said goodbye to the Wandering Isle, it wasn't just a goodbye to a zone, it was a goodbye to the innocence of their beginning. I would like to think a lot of us look back on the Jade Forest as a really memorable zone, not just because it was the first step into Pandaria, but because of how rich and atmospheric it was. This zone offered a true sense of exploration and wonder, especially the first time through. It was also the first place where players began to see just how ambitious Mists was. You'd often hear people say things like, "This doesn't feel like WoW anymore," but they didn't always mean it in a bad way. The music, the lighting, the pacing, it all felt different, more patient, more confident. It had some great quests too, particularly the storytelling with Kirin, Shokia and Rico. I'll never forget the first time I played through this and how much I laughed when Rico asked Kirin for a kiss.
So, can Rico get kissed?
Of course. Let me just take off my mask.
What the ook is wrong with your face. You chicken dead.
And of course, the crazy witch Pandaren turning people into jade statues. Something that always sticks out in my mind with the Jade Forest is the Order of the Cloud Serpent, tucked away in the northeastern cliffs. You raised your own Cloud Serpent from a hatchling, you trained with it, raced it, bonded with it, and by the end of the questline, when your fully grown serpent flew beside you, this didn't just feel like another mount, this one felt like yours. The Jade Forest was the beginning of a journey that would forever shape players' experiences in Pandaria. It set the tone for an expansion filled with wonder, discovery, and a deeper connection to the world of Azeroth. As players left, they carried with them the memories of their first steps into a new land, a place that, for many, would remain a lasting symbol of what Mists of Pandaria was all about, a new chapter waiting to be explored. The Valley of the Four Winds is one of my all-time favourite zones in WoW. Bright, breezy, and full of life. It traded battlefields for barley fields, a place where the biggest danger might just be an angry goat. It was slower, more personal, and for a lot of players, it was kind of magical. If you're old like me, you probably remember Farmville blowing up on Facebook. Around that time, it felt like every game was adding some kind of farming or cozy progression system, and WoW's answer was the Tillers. The Tillers were tied to a reputation system where you could increase your standing with different NPCs by helping them on their farms. When you first start, you're given your very own farm plot, which you can tend to by planting crops, watering them, pulling weeds, and scaring off vermin. As you level up your reputation with these NPCs by completing various farm tasks, you unlock rewards like new recipes, unique crops to grow, and even the ability to expand your farm with additional plots. While there are no big gear rewards from this is a very fondly remembered system in Mists of Pandaria. It was light-hearted and weirdly addictive. And of course we had Galleon, a towering Mogu'shan carrying a war cart full of bandits, one of Mists of Pandaria's first world bosses. The reason I think the Valley of the Four Winds worked so well, and why it stands as one of my favourite zones, is because it trusted players to enjoy the simple things. A quiet hilltop, a playful questline, a warm village. This zone was brilliant. Half Hill didn't just feel like a quest hub, it felt like a home. Krasarang Wilds was easy to overlook at first. Murky, overgrown, and wild. And if you just followed the main story, it was a brief stopover. Nat Pagle had set up shop at Angler's Wharf, introducing the laid-back Anglers faction. Fishing, daily quests, and rewards like a water-walking mount. Then came patch 5.1, and everything changed. Krasarang became the front line of a new war. The Horde and Alliance launched full-scale invasions, establishing massive footholds, Lion's Landing, and Domination Point. It wasn't just visual either. The zone got new daily hubs, evolving quest lines, and cinematic-driven stories tied to Dominance Offensive and Operation Shield Wall. Faction leaders like Garrosh, Jaina, and Varian took centre stage. It was one of the first times the zone evolved so meaningfully mid-expansion. From the farmlands of southern Pandaria, players crossed the Veiled Stair, a winding path into the Highlands. Hidden here was the Tavern in the Mists, where you begin Rathian's legendary questline. It also housed the elusive Black Market Auction House and the Terrace of Endless Spring Raid. Beyond that, it led into the cold towering peaks of Kunlai Summit. Kunlai was a real spectacle. Snow-covered cliffs, steep mountain passes, and monasteries in the clouds. At its heart was the Temple of the White Tiger, home to Xuen, one of the 4 August Celestials. Players had to prove themselves in a brief combat trial before entering the Veil. A small moment, but one that stuck. You'd also encounter the Shadowpan, stoic protectors tasked with keeping darkness at bay. Their full story would come later in Townlong Steppes, but here they added quiet tension. I want to give a shout out to Mount Neverest, Pandaria's highest point. A cheeky play on Everest, obviously. It became a quiet goal. Climb it, just to say you did. WoW didn't usually offer this kind of verticality, and Kunlai handled it beautifully. In ancient tales, this was where Emperor Xiaohao meditated, seeking clarity as he wrestled with fear and doubt. And of course, it would be remiss not to mention the Grand Expedition Yak. If you were lucky, or rich enough, to buy it from Uncle Big Pocket, you unlocked a portable transmogrifier, repair, and vendor mount. It's a must-have, really. A staple of modern WoW. Even today, you still see it everywhere. A lasting reminder of Mist's attention to flair. The Shah of Anger was also housed here, making Kunlai one of the expansion's most memorable battlegrounds. I thought the zones in Pandaria were gorgeous, until we got here. By the time you reached Townlong Steps, Pandaria's tone had changed completely. Gone were the peaceful farms. This was the front line. This was the first zone where you fought the Mantid head-on. You teamed up with the Shadowpan, now fully in the spotlight. Through daily quests, you fought alongside rotating companions who added personality to the grind. A small attempt at variety in a reputation system that, like many in Mists, became a chore over time, which we'll come on to soon. For me, Townlong wasn't about sweeping moments. It was about the slow march forward. It was bleak, heavy, but important. Even the music felt tired here. Slow, drifting, mournful. It matched the sense of attrition that players felt. It proved to be a great setup for the final zone. The Dread Wastes was just so visually unappealing to me. Amber-coated terrain, twisted trees, and a sense that something just wasn't right here. It was huge, non-linear, and swarming with Mantid. Players would awaken the Klaxi, an ancient order who weren't enemies, but not exactly allies either. The Klaxi reputation involved daily quests tied to the paragons you unlocked. Some gave unique combat buffs to add some variety. The Dread Wastes wasn't the prettiest zone, or even the most fun to quest in, but it stuck with people. The Vale of Eternal Blossoms was Pandaria's heart, geographically and symbolically. This was where the expansion's capitals sat, the Shrine of Seven Stars and the Shrine of Two Moons. But it wasn't accessible from the start. At launch, the Vale was sealed off, guarded by the Golden Lotus. Gaining entry required level 90 and completing an initiation storyline. The Golden Lotus offered daily quests focusing on fighting the Mogu and supporting their efforts to resist the Mogu's influence in Pandaria. At first, it felt exciting. New areas unlocked with progress, but for many, that excitement faded fast. Not all dailies were a grind though. One of my favourites was up on the Serpent's Spine, a fast-paced racing mini-game dodging obstacles like something out of Crash Bandicoot. It was silly, unexpected, and a great example of how Mists wasn't afraid to get weird. I'll talk about dailies and Burnout in a bit more detail shortly. A memory that always stuck out with me in the Vale was a rare Tauren named Yorick Sharpeye, who sat peacefully near a tree. Defeat him, and you could earn a toy that turns you into Mr. Smite, the iconic Deadmines pirate. One of those weird little secrets that made the world feel playful. And high above the Vale floated Alani, a glowing red cloud serpent, invulnerable unless you crafted the Sky Crystal. That required collecting 10 Sky Shards. Of course, the Vale wouldn't stay untouched. In time, it was corrupted. Golden trees turned black, skies filled with smoke. The zone that once felt like a sanctuary became a battlefield. Finally, just off the northern coast of Kunlai, the Isle of Giants, an eerie bone-covered island. This was no questing zone, this was a hunting ground. Massive dinosaur bones, elite beasts, and one colossal world boss, Undasta. What I liked about this isle was that it practically demanded group play. Here you could earn the Bone White Primal Raptor mount. This mount could be obtained by collecting bones which were later traded for the raptor. Players could also earn other recoloured raptors from the eggs found on the island. As beautiful as the zones were, Mists had a growing problem, one that became harder to ignore. Reputation gating, daily overload, burnout. At launch, nearly every major reward was locked behind a faction reputation. Gear, crafting, vanity items, mounts. To earn it, you did daily quests. Every day. For every faction. And just before launch, Blizzard made a major change. They removed the 25 daily quest cap. It sounded like freedom, but in practice, it meant players could, and felt they had to, do dozens each day. It wasn't just the Golden Lotus. There was the Klaxi, the Cloud Serpent, the Tillers, the Anglers, the Shadowpan, the August Celestials, each with their own hub, currency, and requirements. Often chained, one needed to be completed to unlock another. For completionists and progression-minded players, it became overwhelming. Not because the content was bad, but because there was so much, and no clear ceiling. It led to what many now call daily burnouts, a sense that joy was buried under checklists and repetition. Think of BFA for example. Blizzard did try to course correct. Later patches added variety and story-driven progress, and future expansions would learn from this. Sometimes. Even so, these zones were unforgettable. Mists of Pandaria delivered some of the most visually striking and tonally unique areas in WoW's history, and maybe that's what made it special. Whether you were farming turnips, racing your Cloud Serpent, or climbing Mount Everest, Pandaria asked us to slow down, to notice, to be there. The Isle of Thunder was probably one of the most ambitious post-launch zones created at the time. It became a battleground where the Kirin Tor Offensive and the Sunreaver Assault fought for control, while the Shadowpan Assault focused on their ultimate goal, taking down Shen, the Thunder King. Players accessed the Isle through portals near the faction camps in Townlong Steppes, with no flying allowed, adding to the grounded, immersive experience. The island featured a mix of open-world questing, faction war campaigns, daily objectives, and unlockable content that expanded as players progressed. The Isle of Thunder was pivotal with advancing the narrative, allowing players to experience the rising tension and final steps towards the epic showdown in the Throne of Thunder raid. Whilst I said I wasn't a big PvPer, one of the standout features was the dynamic PvP environment. The Kirin Tor Offensive and Sunreaver Assault pushed forward, fighting over beachheads and strategic points, creating a living warzone. The island was also packed with rare mobs and hidden secrets, including a host of challenging and engaging side objectives. A memorable quest for me was the Crumbled Chamberlain, a timed scavenger hunt that had players scouring the island to reassemble the shattered remains of Shen's royal attendant. With only 10 minutes to succeed, it turned exploration into a frantic race, blending humour, lore, and a dash of pressure into one of the Isle's most memorable quests. And for those on Rathian's legendary questline, the island held even greater meaning. Deep within the Thunder King's domain, the Thunderforged became the site of a pivotal moment, where players, guided by Rathian, forged their powerful legendary metagem in a solo scenario. This infused their gear with thunderous new power and tied the legendary narrative directly into the heart of Pandaria's endgame. One of the unique and memorable highlights was the Trove of the Thunder King, a challenging solo scenario where players raced against the clock inside Shen's ancient citadel to grab as much treasure as possible. Players began by offering a key to Taoshi, a Shadowpan scout, who opened the gates to the treasure-filled chambers. What followed was a thrilling gauntlet of traps, lightning blasts, patrolling stone guardians, and enemy trolls, requiring precise timing and quick reflexes. Along the way, players loot gold, rare crafting materials, and powerful artifacts while dodging deadly lightning walls and massive stone sentries. The final challenge was an elite troll boss, Godholt Golken, guarding the deepest vaults. Successful runs rewarded players with valuable loot and keys to open burial troves scattered around the island, some of the best gear available outside of raids at the time. I thought this was great. It was good fun, very memorable, and a nice change of pace. The Isle of Thunder was also home to Nalak the Stormlord, one of the most infamous world bosses of the expansion. Nalak was a sought-after target for many players. Not only did it drop high-tier loot, but also had a chance to reward players with a highly coveted mount. The Isle of Thunder's design, scope, and narrative integration made it a milestone in WoW's evolution. It was a bold experiment in dynamic layered content that rewarded player investment across PvE and PvP, solo and group play. It was a trailblazer, and its DNA echoes in many future zones, remembered fondly as a complex and defining chapter in Pandaria's story. At the heart of Mists of Pandaria's narrative was a legendary questline that spanned the entire expansion. A slow-burning storyline built around the Black Prince Rathian, son of Deathwing. Unlike previous legendaries tied to either RNG or raid roles, this Cloak questline was available to all players, regardless of class or spec. It was Blizzard's most ambitious attempt yet to deliver a legendary experience that felt personal, story-rich, and achievable. Through patch after patch, players followed Rathian's journey, assisting him in gathering intelligence, facing down powerful foes, and slowly piecing together a vision of Azeroth's future. Along the way, we saw major beats like Rathian's uneasy friendship with Prince Anduin, his disillusionment with the factions, and his increasing obsession with preparing for an inevitable Burning Legion invasion. It was a story filled with philosophical weight, where Rathian questioned not just who should lead, but whether peace was even possible. The questline sent players across Pandaria collecting sigils, defeating world bosses, engaging in scenario-based storytelling, and earning reputation. It was a grind, but it meant something. Every patch brought new developments and new steps, and by the end, players were rewarded with something truly iconic, their very own legendary cloak. The final chapter culminated in a solo scenario, a one-on-one challenge where Rathian stands beside you as you fight through trials and confront a powerful final foe. It was the emotional and mechanical crescendo of the entire journey, a moment where the story and gameplay aligned beautifully, driving home the personal nature of the reward. Each cloak came with a unique effect based on your role. Tanks, healers, and DPS all received different procs designed to suit their playstyle, and they weren't just strong, they looked amazing. The moment you unlocked your legendary, it sprouted glowing wings during combat, bursting to life with arcane, fire, shadow, or wind energy depending on your specialization. It was a visual reward that felt earned, and unmistakably iconic. The Cloak also unlocked access to Ordos, a powerful world boss on the Timeless Isle, but only those who had completed the full questline could even enter his domain, making the Cloak not just a reward, but a key to future content. As great as this all sounds, it wasn't without its flaws. Some players found the grind a bit too reliant on RNG, especially during the earlier phases that required collecting sigils and runestones from bosses. Progression could feel slow if you were unlucky with drops, and since each chapter was tied to the current patch, others felt restricted by the time-gated nature of the questline. Even still, these limitations didn't outweigh the impact of the experience. They were just the growing pains of trying something bold and new. Today, the questline has been removed from the live game, making it one of the few legendary experiences you can't go back and complete. In that way, it became a moment in time, a journey shared by those who were there, and remembered fondly for how it made players feel involved in something much bigger than themselves. Pet battles were introduced in Mists of Pandaria as a new minigame that lets players collect, train, and battle with their favourite in-game pets. Think of it as WoW's take on Pokémon. Players could capture creatures in the wild, level them up, and challenge both NPCs and other players in strategic turn-based combat. Much like the expansion itself, pet battles were met with skepticism. The pet battle system was mocked by some as too light-hearted or gimmicky, but beneath the surface was one of the most charming and unexpected deep features WoW had seen in years. At first, they were seen as a quirky side activity, but over time, they became a beloved and surprisingly deep part of the game. For collectors and completionists especially, hunting rare pets and building the perfect team added a rewarding layer of gameplay outside of the usual dungeons and raids. Pet battles would also encourage players to re-explore Azeroth. Many rare pets were tied to specific zones, events, or weather conditions, leading players to revisit old content in a fresh way. Beyond just collecting, pet battles offered a lighter, more casual side to WoW that appealed to a wide range of players. It was a way to engage with the world's creatures in a new way, and even become a social activity, challenging friends or strangers to battles and sharing strategies. The variety of pets was impressive. Everything from common critters like squirrels and rabbits to rare exotic creatures tied to specific zones or events. Each pet belonged to a specific family, such as beast, mechanical, or undead for example, and had its own set of unique abilities. This meant players had to carefully build their teams and think strategically, taking strengths and weaknesses into account. Pets could be leveled up, unlocking new abilities and becoming stronger over time, adding a satisfying sense of progression to each battle. There were NPC pet trainers scattered across Azeroth which offered quests and tough battles, encouraging players to explore and master the system. Over time, a passionate community would grow around pet battles, sharing guides, competing in tournaments. At the peak of the system was the Celestial Tournament, a prestigious no-healing gauntlet introduced in patch 5.4. It required a deep and well-rounded roster, with players needing to defeat multiple powerful trainers in a single run. Succeeding in the tournament rewarded celestial pets modelled after Pandaria's August Celestials. These became a true badge of honour among pet battle veterans. In many ways, it was WoW's most accessible form of endgame, turn-based, relaxing, and playable in short bursts without needing a raid group or high-end gear. And remarkably, it stuck. More than a decade later, pet battles are still being updated with new pets, trainers, and achievements every expansion. What started as a fun diversion became one of the most enduring systems in WoW, fitting for an expansion that proved everyone wrong. Scenarios were a fresh addition in Mists of Pandaria, introducing short, 3-player instances built around progressive objectives and compelling story arcs. Unlike traditional dungeons or raids, scenarios were completely role-less, meaning you didn't need to worry about having a tank or a healer to succeed. Any class combination could work, making them accessible and flexible for players looking to experience cooperative content without the pressure of strict group composition. One of the biggest draws of scenarios was the reward system. They offered a faster, more casual way to earn reputation, valour, gear, and achievements, serving as a welcome alternative to longer, more demanding dungeons or raid runs. Many were also tied into major faction campaigns like Operation Shieldwall and the Dominance Offensive, acting as narrative milestones while helping players progress reputations or weekly goals. Patch 5.3 introduced heroic scenarios, which added a layer of challenge for pre-made groups. These harder versions came with bonus objectives and could reward higher item level gear, proving that scenarios weren't just lightweight content, they had meaningful rewards for progression focused players too. Some scenarios weren't just side stories, they were crucial chapters in the expansion's larger narrative. For example, A Little Patience highlighted Varian Rin's growth as a leader during the Alliance's campaign in Krasarang Wilds, while Dagger in the Dark let Horde players witness Vol'jin's growing suspicion of Garrosh. These weren't just filler, they delivered plot lines you couldn't see anywhere else, often with voice acting, in-game cinematics, and phasing to immerse you in the moment. Beyond efficiency, scenarios were also a breath of fresh air. The engaging narratives and unique mechanics made them a fun break from the usual grind. Memorable moments like Theramor's Fall, The Secrets of Ragefire, and The Dark Heart of Pandaria delivered some of the expansion's most cinematic story beats, making players feel like they were active participants in key events across Pandaria. Scenarios also encouraged social play in a new way. Because you didn't need to coordinate traditional roles, it was easier for friends to group up and tackle content together, or for more casual players to jump in without the pressure of filling a specific role. This flexibility was a big part of why many players appreciated scenarios as a refreshing change of pace. More importantly, scenarios helped lay the groundwork for several quality of life improvements in WoW's group content. Their success showed Blizzard that smaller, more bite-sized experiences could still be meaningful and rewarding, influencing future designs like Proving Grounds, artifact acquisition quests in Legion, and even the War Within's Delves. The tech and philosophy behind scenarios endured, long after the format itself faded. From Warlords of Draenor onward, no new 3-player endgame scenarios were added. Instead, Blizzard began repurposing scenario mechanics for solo or campaign-driven quests, often using the same instanced framework for cinematic story moments. And while not universally loved, some players found scenarios too short or lacking challenge compared to dungeons. They remained an important step in Blizzard's evolving approach to group content, a quiet innovation that showed WoW didn't need to be all or nothing. It could also be small, smart, and story-driven. They may not have lasted, but scenarios showed that even the smallest moments, 3 players, 10 minutes, 1 story, could still leave a lasting mark. The Brawlers Guild also arrived with Mists of Pandaria, delivering a gladiator-style solo challenge that offered a very different kind of gameplay from standard dungeons and raids. Accessible through a secretive quest chain in Stormwind for Alliance and Orgrimmar for Horde, it felt like joining an underground fight club. No groups, no raids, just you, a crowd of onlookers, and one tough boss at a time. Fights were fast, brutal, and often bizarre, featuring a roster of quirky and challenging enemies that tested individual player skill, quick thinking, and class mastery. From Johnny Awesome to Stitches, the Brawlers Guild leaned into the weird, and that was part of the charm. But the real magic wasn't just in the fights, it was in the atmosphere. Players would queue up, form informal lines, cheer each other on, and share tips between rounds. While Alliance and Horde had separate locations, the experience felt universally shared. It was one of the rare systems in WoW that encouraged solo progression, but also created a sense of collective effort. There was even spectator mode, letting people gather around the ring and watch fights play out in real time, a rare feature at the time that added a sense of scale and theatre to the whole experience. Many players still fondly remember the atmosphere, the tension before your name was called, the roar of the crowd when you finally beat that one boss you'd been stuck on for hours. And if you want a taste of the challenge, look no further than Uhuru, often cited as one of the hardest Brawler Guild bosses ever. During his fight, Uhuru becomes nearly invulnerable behind a divine shield and summons angelic adds called Avenging Angels. Defeating these adds causes beams of holy light to appear, and only by luring Uhuru into these beams can you break his shield and deal real damage. It was a brutal DPS and positioning check with a tight enrage timer that punished even the smallest mistakes. The Brawlers Guild was one of the most experimental, community-driven systems WoW had ever introduced. It didn't try to be an endgame pillar, it just offered something different. A challenge, a crowd, a moment in the spotlight, and for many, that was enough. If the Brawlers Guild was solo content turned into a spectacle, with a roaring crowd, wild fights, and bragging rights, then this was its quieter cousin. Tucked away in the Temple of the White Tiger, past the majestic statues and the monks, was a silent little room, with no audience, no glory, just focus. The Proving Grounds. Added in patch 5.4, Proving Grounds were Blizzard's first real attempt to help players improve their roles through structured solo challenges. No raid mechanics, no group dynamics, just you, your abilities, and a timer ticking down. Whether you were tank, healer, or DPS, there was a bronze, silver, or gold challenge waiting for you, and if you really wanted to flex, there was endless mode, wave after wave of increasing difficulty, pushing your cooldowns, timing, and sanity to the limit. The trials were basic by today's standards, but back then, they were quietly revolutionary, I think. DPS had to race against the clock, managing cleave, interrupts, and mobility. Tanks had to keep a fragile NPC healer alive while fending off mobs, and healers, they had to deal with the real final boss, an AI party that stood in fire, didn't use defensives, and forgot what line of sight meant. For casual players, it was a low-stakes space to learn. For veterans, it was a fun flex, especially in endless mode. It never hit the mainstream, but for some, it was the first taste of solo prestige. Come Warlords of Draenor, silver rank became a requirement to queue for heroic dungeons. But it wasn't perfect. Proving Grounds lacked meaningful incentives. No loot, no mount, and barely any achievements beyond wave count. The feedback was vague too. You either passed, or you didn't. And unless you were self-motivated, there wasn't much reason to return. Today, Proving Grounds still technically exist, hidden in class holes or tucked away in some menu probably. Most players probably don't even remember how to get there. I know I don't. But their legacy, you can feel it. To every challenge that says, hey, you've got this, just prove it. And it was proof that not every challenge in WoW needs to be a group activity. Proving Grounds didn't ask you to be perfect, just to try. When Mists of Pandaria launched, the dungeons were one of those things that made the expansion feel both familiar and fresh. I won't lie, I'm not particularly fond of the Mists of Pandaria dungeons these days. Every time Time Walking rolls around, I can't help but dread it, but back then, there was something undeniably cool about running these for the first time. Let's start with one of my favourites, Temple of the Jade Serpent. What made this dungeon stand out for me was the pacing. It struck a really nice balance between exploration and action, and the fact you could take different paths through the temple added some welcome replayability. The bosses left a good impression too. Wise Mari's fight with the spinning water beam is a good example. You actually had to move and adapt to the room, rather than just standing still and burning the boss. Lorewalker Stonestep was interesting as well, partly because his fight had two versions. One where you helped extinguish the Five Suns, and another corrupted version where you had to balance strife and peril. Liu Flameheart was my favourite fight in the dungeon. Watching her fall to the Shar of Doubt and summon Yulon the Jade Serpent mid-fight, it just made the encounter feel bigger than it actually was. That whole sequence, her inner turmoil, her transformation, it all tied into the expansion story so well. And then of course the final boss, the Shar of Doubt. Facing literal reflections of yourself as part of the fight was very cool. It wasn't just a cool mechanic, it played directly into Pandaria's themes, that idea of confronting your own doubts, your own fears. It's no wonder this dungeon still gets remembered fondly. In fact, it made its way back into the Mythic Plus rotation during Dragonflight's first season, a testament to how well it's held up. Stormstout Brewery was one of the real standouts for me, mostly because of how fun and chaotic it felt. It completely contrasted with a lot of other dungeons in the expansion. This place wasn't about ancient ruins or corrupted temples, it was just drunken Pandaren nonsense, and I loved it. The first boss, Ook Ook, set the tone straight away. Rolling barrels bouncing all over the room while you try to dodge and deal damage. It was frantic, ridiculous, but it was pretty fun. Smash barrel into boss, big numbers, who doesn't love that? Then came Hoptalis. You had hoplings, hoppers, boppers, waves of ads constantly trying to overwhelm the group. When I think about this boss, I always think of the big ol' hammer scattered around the place and just smashing your way through the madness. The fight itself could get hectic, ads charging everywhere, dodging carrot breath, dealing with whirlwinds. There was quite a bit going on with this one. Finally, you had Yanzu the Uncasqued, Uncle Gao's completely unhinged brewing experiment. This fight was a bit mad. Yanzu cycling through random brew effects, growing larger, dealing more damage, and then of course the carbonation mechanic. The whole room fills with foam, locking you in place until you grab a fizzy bubble and lift off the ground to avoid it. This dungeon was just so silly. It was fun, and it captured the humour, chaos, and whimsy of Pandaria perfectly. It can't just be me who has a problem with this dungeon. Gate of the Setting Sun just never really did it for me. It's got a cool idea, the Mantage Siege, fighting to defend Pandaria, but in practice, I was never a fan of the environment and the bosses left me underwhelmed. The first boss brought some chaos with bombs strapped to players. It wasn't the most exciting fight, but the random explosions kept things mildly entertaining. I thought the second boss was pretty annoying. dive-bombing the area while players scramble to dodge the fire trails. The constant running back and forth just got tedious after a while. Not a fun fight for me at all. When I think of the third boss, the Frenzied Assault was memorable. It's always funny watching someone get absolutely owned by it. And finally, Raygon, the giant mantid smashing through the gates. You had to break through his armour, hit the weak spot, and deal with hive mind buffs. It was definitely unique, but not my thing. The Mantid Siege story, cool enough, but the fights, not an enjoyer personally. I still groan whenever this dungeon shows up in Time Walking. Mogu'shan Palace had a lot of potential. Steeped in the history of the Mogu, setting aside this grand eerie palace filled with statues, carvings, and relics of their old empire. Visually, it absolutely nailed the atmosphere. The dungeon itself, decent I think. It kicks off with the Trial of the King, where you take on 3 Mogu warriors one after the other, each with their own unique set of abilities. It had potential to get a little hectic if people weren't paying attention, but nothing to really write home about. It was alright, nothing special. After that, you've got Gekken leading his little Saurok raiding party into the palace. It could definitely get a bit chaotic here. You had 4 different adds to deal with, all doing their own thing. Stuns, healing spells, shields, the usual recipe for frustration if your group wasn't paying attention. And of course, the longer they stayed alive, the stronger Gekken got, so things could snowball fast. I wouldn't describe this fight as memorable or anything, but it could definitely trip up groups that weren't organised. Shen the Weapon Master though, he was great. Axes flying across the room, spinning blades, fire circling the arena, crossbows launching bolts from the wall. It was good fun. It could get a little overwhelming if your group wasn't paying attention, but I really liked the madness of this fight. Compared to the rest of the dungeon, it was easily the most fun and memorable encounter. Overall, I'd say the highlight of Mogu'shan Palace was the setting and the lore more than the actual fights. It gave a cool glimpse into the Mogu and their empire. Shadowpan Monastery was one of those dungeons that really nailed the atmosphere. High up in the mountains, surrounded by snow and ancient halls, it felt like the perfect home for the Shadowpan, those elite Pandaren warriors guarding against the Shah. The first boss, Gu Cloudstrike, kicks things off, a once revered trainer, now twisted by the Shah. You've got lightning everywhere, his serpent flying around. Visually, it was very cool, but pretty straightforward I thought. Before Master Snowdrift, you had to run this gauntlet dodging ice arrows and fighting waves of Pandaren. It probably became annoying for people with replayability, but I really liked it the first time I saw it. Master Snowdrift himself is a great little martial arts showdown, classic find the real master stuff with mirror images and fast-paced phases. Then comes the Shah of Violence, and I've got to say this right now, those spikes shooting out of the ground, absolute bullshit. I swear they always went off faster than they should have. Besides that, this fight was okay. Finally, you've got Taranzu, the Shadowpan leader, battling his own inner hatred. It's a cool concept. You're literally fighting the physical embodiment of his rage while trying to clear the haze and avoid getting dragged into shadow puddles. It's not the hardest fight, but the theme of it really makes it stand out. Overall, I really liked this dungeon. It mixed martial arts, shark corruption, and some solid Pandaria lore into a memorable dungeon. Definitely one of the better ones from Mists of Pandaria in my opinion. This is another dungeon I'm not a giant fan of. It drops you right into the Mantid Assault on one of Pandaria's sacred spots, but I've always found this one just a bit lame personally. First up is Vizier Jinbak, a Mantid alchemist chucking sap everywhere. The whole fight basically revolves around this giant puddle that keeps growing, and your job is to stand in it to shrink it down before he blows the whole thing up. Simple enough concept. Commander Vojak is probably the most memorable fight in here for me. The whole thing kicks off as a proper siege, Mantid swarming the platform and escaped Pandaren prisoners helping throw barrels of tar across the battlefield to slow the assault. You've got adds running in from all directions, swarmer packs, demolishers loaded with explosives ready to blow up the second they die, and those amber wings up top dropping bombs on your head. It can get overwhelming fast if you don't stay on top of things. Eventually, Vojak himself jumps into the fight and darts around slicing through players. This is probably the most fun fight in the dungeon for me. General Pavelak keeps the throwing trend alive. You've got Mantid pouring in, explosions going off, and this time you're lobbing siege explosives right back at them. It's one of those fights where timing actually mattered. You can't just chuck the bombs anywhere. You've got to coordinate, get the positioning right, or risk blowing yourself and your group to pieces. Wingleader Neronok wraps things up with quite a movement-heavy fight. You've got puddles of sticky resin everywhere, patches of caustic pitch slowing you down, and constant gusts of wind trying to knock you off the platform. It's one of those fights where you're basically never standing still. between dodging, repositioning, and trying to keep damage going while Neranok soars overhead. I can't quite explain why I don't get on with this dungeon. It's not dreadful, it blends manted aggression with some genuinely engaging mechanics. The interactive bits like throwing pots and explosives definitely add for some fun moments, but overall, the encounters just felt a little repetitive and it never really clicked for me. Scarlet Monastery has always been one of my favourite dungeons from Vanilla WoW. I wouldn't be surprised if it's up there for you too. It's a true icon of the game. From its layout to the bosses, it was the quintessential dungeon for many players, and it holds a special place in the hearts of long-time WoW fans. So seeing Scarlet Monastery return in Mists of Pandaria, reimagined with updated mechanics and a deeper story, was really exciting. The nostalgia hit hard, but the new spin on things kept it feeling fresh and relevant. It's not just a dungeon, it's a symbol of a time in WoW that many of us remember fondly. I enjoyed the inclusion of Lillian Voss. Introduced as the Hooded Crusader, she presents herself as a mysterious figure, watching from the shadows as players make their way through the dungeon. It's only later, after the final boss, that her true identity is revealed, adding a cool layer of story to an already iconic setting. Give us more Scarlet stuff, Blizzard. We'll start off with Scarlet Halls. Scarlet Halls offers a more intense, militarised feel compared to Scarlet Monastery. The dungeon focuses on showing how the Crusaders trained their elite forces and the brutal methods they use to cleanse the world of the undead. The first boss, Houndmaster Brawn, uses his trained pack of dogs to hunt down and tear apart enemies. The encounter focuses on managing the aggressive dogs, avoiding the high damage knife throws, and handling the chaos when Brawn loses control of his dogs later in the fight. Armsmaster Harlan tests players' tanking and positioning abilities. His leap into the centre of the room, followed by a flurry of AoE damage with his Blades of Light, makes for a dynamic, high-mobility challenge. This fight feels like a modern twist of Herod's brutal combat style. Lastly, Flameweaver Kogler. Players need to prevent burning books from spreading flames throughout the room, while dealing with his constant barrage of pyroblasts, fireball volleys, and dragon breath. Halls is good fun. Scarlet Monastery itself starts in the eerie graveyard, transitioning into the more ominous and iconic cathedral. The dungeon keeps most of its original layout, but with updated mechanics and more immersive storytelling. The first boss, Thalnos the Soulrender, is a mage resurrected as a skeletal being after succumbing to the plague of undeath. He commands apparitions and zombified creatures, raising fallen soldiers of the Argent Crusade to fight against players. Brother Korlov challenges players with his martial prowess. He unleashes fiery attacks like Blazing Fists and Firestorm Kick, which create dangerous fiery zones to avoid. This guy always makes me think of Ivan Drago from Rocky IV.
If you die, you die.
Commander Durand, the new military leader of the Scarlet Crusade, brings speed and brutality to the encounter, using rapid strikes like Flash of Steel and Dashing Strike to inflict heavy damage. And true to tradition, when he falls, Whitemane resurrects him just like she did Mogu'shan, forcing players to deal with both threats at once. Once Whitemane is defeated, Lillian Voss steps forward, revealing herself as the Hooded Crusader. She had directed players to retrieve the Blades of the Anointed, the only weapon capable of permanently killing Whitemane, adding a personal touch to the dungeon's conclusion as she continues her own quest for vengeance against the Scarlet Crusade. Scarlet Monastery is one of those pillars of World of Warcraft that's been loved by players since day one. It's a dungeon that left a lasting mark on the game. Even today, players still clamour for more Scarlet Crusade content. Season of Discovery introduced the Scarlet Enclave raid, allowing players to once again engage with the Scarlet Crusade's lore, this time in a new raid environment. Lillian Voss actually featured as a boss in that raid too. There's a little bit of trivia for you, if you didn't know. Like Scarlet Monastery, I was really excited to see Scholarmance make a return in Mists of Pandaria because it brought back memories of my time in Vanilla WoW. Any chance to revisit the old world always makes my heart happy, and this dungeon was no exception. The design of Scholarmance is a fantastic mix of nostalgia and new content. The dungeon still carries that eerie atmospheric vibe that made the original so memorable. First up is Instructor Chillheart, a lich who throws a bunch of frost magic around and summons adds. The only interesting part is that after you kill her, her magic escapes into her phylactery, so you've got to break that too, or she'll be back for round 2. It's nothing crazy, but I always thought that extra step with the phylactery gave the fight a bit more character. Next is Jandis Barov, a mage who uses illusions to confuse players. As the fight progresses, she creates multiple copies of herself and players have to figure out which one's real. I thought this was a cool mechanic. As we progress, Lillian Voss makes another appearance, but this time she's not the guiding hand she was in Scarlet Monastery. Here, she's caught in a struggle, haunted by her past and cursed undead nature. Then we face Rattlegore, the reanimated monstrosity from Underhull. He launches bone spikes at players and summons Soul Flame to cover the room in fire. Players can protect themselves from Bone Spike by interacting with bone piles scattered around the room, which grant a charge of bone armour. It was cool to see Rattlegore again, but this fight was kind of whatever to me. As we continue, Darkmaster Gandling takes control of Voss, forcing her to fight with powerful Runeblade strikes and Darkfire attacks. At 60% health, Lillian's soul is torn from her body, and her soul begins attacking the players with Blazing Soul, which inflicts fire damage to all players, and Fixate Anger, where she targets a single player. In the final phase, Lillian's soul reunites with her body, and she attempts to attack Darkmaster Gandling. Darkmaster Gandling closes out Scholomance, though truthfully, the fight itself never really lived up to the build-up. It's cool seeing him again, especially for old school players, but the actual encounter, pretty straightforward. He throws out a few fire spells, summons his failed students, and every now and then teleports someone off for a harsh lesson, but nothing that really stands out. The real highlight for me was the atmosphere and Lillian Voss's story. Scholomance in Mists of Pandaria brought back a lot of nostalgia for me. It was nice to see again. It still had that creepy vibe, and weaving Lillian Voss's story into it was cool. As a little throwback, I was happy. Overall, the Dungeons of Mists of Pandaria offered a unique blend of nostalgia, new content, and varied gameplay that really defined the expansion. Temple of the Jade Serpent, Stormstout Brewery, Shadowpan Monastery, they all stood out in their own way for me. Whether through rich lore, chaotic fun, or deeper emotional stakes, these are the dungeons that I look back on fondly, and they left a lasting impression. The real cherry on the top, absolutely the return of Scarlet Monastery and Scholomance. Coming back to these classic dungeons from Vanilla WoW with updated mechanics and richer storytelling was a real treat. It felt like stepping back into WoW history, but with a fresh spin that kept the experience exciting. The dungeons blended nostalgia with innovation perfectly, familiar, but with just enough new twists to keep things fresh. But for players chasing something a bit more intense, well, that's what challenge modes were made for. Challenge modes were one of the standout features in Mists of Pandaria. These special time-based dungeon runs pushed players to complete dungeons as fast as possible, while maintaining high levels of performance. Does that sound familiar? The dungeons were altered with additional challenges such as limited resources or more powerful enemies. Players could earn unique rewards, including the coveted challenge mode armor sets, which were cosmetic and highly sought after. This was also one of the first times that players could compare performance across realms, thanks to the introduction of leaderboards. It created a competitive environment where every second counted, and where execution mattered more than raw power. Gear was scaled down, meaning everyone was on an even playing field. What set you apart was skill, strategy, and teamwork. There were also realm-best titles for each dungeon, like Siegebreaker or Darkmaster, temporary badges of honour that disappeared when somebody else beat your time. I was never really that into challenge modes personally, or I guess I got into it too late. I only managed to achieve silver, and I sorely regret not getting gold because the Paladin set was incredible. Every time I see someone wearing it, I'm reminded of what I missed. And that was the magic of it. You had to earn it when it mattered, and if you didn't, that was it. You missed your chance. In hindsight, challenge modes were more than just a side feature. They were the prototype, the foundation for what would eventually become Mythic Plus. The scaling, the timer, the emphasis on routing and execution, all of it started here. Even the teleports and prestige titles have their echoes in the systems we use today. Today, the original challenge mode dungeons are gone. Their leaderboards wiped, their titles retired, their rewards unobtainable. But their legacy lives on in every keystone you slot, every plus 15 you push. It all started with a timer, a scaled down set of gear, and 5 players chasing gold. When I think about Mists of Pandaria's raids, the first 3 were okay. Not bad, just not great, especially compared to what followed. But then, Throne of Thunder and Siege of Orgrimmar, those might possibly be in my top 5 raids of all time. Throne for sure. Mogu'shan Vaults was the first raid of Mists of Pandaria, and looking back, it was fine. Not terrible by any stretch, just not particularly memorable. It had a cool setting. Ancient Titan vaults buried beneath Kunlai summit. A strong theme, no doubt, but the raid just didn't quite hit the highs I was hoping for coming into a brand new expansion. The Stone Guard was the first boss of Mogu'shan Vaults, and yeah, it existed. I'm being harsh. It was one of those typical early expansion openers. A trio of big rock guardians, some colour-coded gems, and a shared health pool to keep things interesting. Technically, it wasn't a bad fight. You had positioning to manage, annoying chains linking players together, and the usual stand here, don't stand there routine to keep you awake. I didn't think much of this boss to be honest, but sometimes that's just the way it is with initial bosses. It was a fine first encounter. Feng the Accursed, cool name, cool atmosphere, forgettable fight. This guy was basically your standard second boss with phases encounter. He absorbed the power of fallen Mogu champions, so each phase had its own elemental gimmick. Lightning, fire, arcane. Tanks had to mess around with special barriers, the rest of the raid dodged stuff, and eventually he falls over. It wasn't bad. Mechanically it was decent enough, but I can't say it leaves much of a lasting impression. Garrosh the Spirit Binder was one of those pleasant surprises. A cool theme, solid mechanics. You had players popping in and out of the spirit world, cleansing debuffs and trying not to completely wipe the group. It just felt busy, in a good way. The Voodoo Dolls mechanic linked a few players together, and the tank was always one of them, so when they took damage, everyone linked felt it. It made for some tense moments, especially if your healer was slacking or your tank got smacked a little too hard. I've always loved fights with that extra layer of personal responsibility, and the Spirit World phase delivered exactly that. I've got really good memories of this fight, and it's probably my favourite in Mogu'shan Vaults. The Spirit Kings was Blizzard doing their classic council fight, 4 bosses, each with their own gimmick, cycling in one after the other. Xiang, Meng, Subutai and Xian all had their moments to shine, whether it was walls of soldiers, annoying fear mechanics, or giant shadow orbs chasing you around the room. It wasn't the most exciting fight visually, but I thought this was fun. Now this one I liked. Elegon was one of those fights that just looked incredible. That big glowing celestial engine room. The Titan architecture. I believe the younger generation today would say, it's giving Algalon. The fight itself was a mix of phases and energy management. Ads flying around, damage boosts kicking in, platforms disappearing if you weren't paying attention. It could be chaotic, but it was very memorable. Elegon had that special visual flair that really made it stand out. I also think Elegon drops one of the coolest mounts in the game. Will of the Emperor served as the final boss of Mogu'shan Vaults, and I'll give Blizzard credit, they tried something different here. Instead of your usual standstill and DPS encounter, this one turned into a full-on dance routine. The devastating combo mechanic had players dodging and weaving across the floor to avoid massive attacks. It was basically Mogu Revolution. It could be a bit chaotic, and the rest of the fight with ads and Titan gas flooding the room wasn't exactly thrilling, but that dance mechanic, that was memorable. Some players loved it, some players hated it, but at least it made the fight stand out. Not the best climax to a raid, but I don't mind a bit of rhythmic panic. Mogu'shan Vaults was a fine start. Mysterious, thematic, and it had a few cool moments. It was great to get insight into the Mogu, learning about their ancient history and their role in the Pandaria storyline. While it wasn't as difficult as the raids that followed like Throne and Siege, that was by design. With only 6 bosses, it had a more contained feel, easing players into the expansion before the real challenges ahead. Heart of Fear was not my favourite raid. I never quite clicked with it. The aesthetic, all amber, sinew and skittering limbs, felt more grotesque than grand. While that was intentional, it just didn't make the area one I looked forward to revisiting. Imperial Vizier Zorlok kicked things off, flying around his platforms, forcing everyone to hop between them while dodging waves of sonic rings and hiding in protective shields. It was one of those fights where positioning and timing really mattered, and while it wasn't overly difficult, it did a decent job setting the tone for the raid. Bladelord is pretty memorable, at least to me. The fight itself was decent, but what really made it stand out was that infamous wind tunnel phase, getting blasted down a corridor while dodging tornadoes and gusts of wind. It turned into this chaotic little gauntlet that either made you feel like a hero or completely humiliated you in front of your group. The rest of the fight was solid too, the usual teleporting, cone attacks, bleeds, all that stuff, but it's the wind tunnel that people really remember. Heart of Fear wasn't my favourite raid, but I'll give the Bladelord his props. This fight stuck with me. This fight also stuck with me, for the completely wrong reasons. I hated this boss. Weird leg targeting mechanics, and that ridiculous pheromone phase that just turned the whole thing into chaos. It always felt more frustrating than fun. You were swapping pheromones around, trying not to stand in the trails, chopping away at his legs to slow him down, and even if one player slipped up, it could spiral fast. Definitely my least favourite fight in Heart of Fear. But hey, maybe I'm the minority on that one. Any Garrelon enjoyers in the chat? Mel'Jirak sounded cool on paper. loads of adds, crowd control, bombs to dodge, but in practice, it could get chaotic real fast. You had to keep the adds under control, carefully time your stuns and interrupts, all while dancing around these wind bombs that seemed designed to punish the moment anyone lost focus. This fight was definitely a test of patience and your ability not to rage at that one person who couldn't avoid a bomb. Amber Shaper Unsok was weird. The whole fight revolved around transformations, with players getting turned into these amber constructs and suddenly having to manage willpower, avoid wiping the raid, and actually contribute to the fight. It was chaotic, a bit clunky at times, but definitely memorable. It wasn't the cleanest or most straightforward fight, but I kind of liked that. It felt different, and definitely stood out from the usual pile of adds and boss mechanics. Grand Empress Shexia closed out Heart of Fear, and this fight was hectic. Players getting mind controlled, random fear effects going off, it definitely kept you busy. And as a healer, this was one of those fights where everything just hit like a truck. I thought Shexia had some decent moments. The Shah of Fear corruption kicking in for the last phase really ramped up the chaos, and there was just enough going on to make it feel like a proper finale. While I've praised some of the encounters in here, Heart of Fear felt more like an obligation than a destination, at least to me. Even with a few creative ideas, it lacked the magic or menace that defines a great raid. Terrace of Endless Spring was a refreshing contrast to Heart of Fear, both in tone and structure. Where the previous raid was all sinew and chaos, this one felt serene, focused, and almost sacred. What I liked most about this raid was how direct it was. 4 bosses straight to the end. No sprawling labyrinth, no endless trash packs, sometimes less really is more. The first encounter, Protectors of the Endless, was your classic council fight. As each protector fell, the remaining one's health reset and they got stronger, so timing and planning actually mattered. It wasn't overly flashy or complex, but it did what an opening boss should do, test your coordination and set the tone for the raid. I really liked Sulong, as I'm sure many fellow healers did. At night, he's your enemy, twisted by the Shah, breathing shadows, summoning nightmares. But when the day phase rolled around, suddenly he's your friend. Your whole job flips from dodging mechanics to keeping him alive and cleansing away the corruption. It was simple in theory, but felt satisfying, especially if you were a healer. I always thought it was a cool, memorable fight, and weirdly, I still remember the little achievement where you nurtured a tiny plant. Lei Shi was divisive, and not just because she kept vanishing every 2 seconds. Her high-pitched voice lines,
Stay away from me!
Let's just say they were memorable. And the constant hide mechanic basically turned the fight into a frustrating game of where did she go? For DPS, it felt like bursts of actual combat followed by awkward downtime, just spamming AoE and hoping something hit. Then there was the iconic getaway phase, Lei Shi floating around the arena, spraying damage everywhere while the whole group scrambled to keep up. It was chaotic, a bit gimmicky, and probably a low point in an otherwise tight raid. Shah of Fear absolutely nailed the atmosphere. The fight immediately stood out for its scale. You weren't just planted in the middle of the arena, players were getting teleported off to distant platforms dueling corrupted Pandaren, fighting for their place back in the main battle. It added this cool, almost personal layer to the encounter. For a lot of guilds, Shah of Fear was a proper wall, especially early on in Heroic. Wasn't the most complicated boss on paper, but the room for error was tiny, and when the fight transitioned to the Dread Expanse, that dark corrupted realm, things ramped up fast. All in all, maybe not a flawless final boss, but definitely a dramatic, fitting way to cap off the tier, and thematically, it pulled everything together nicely. Throne of Thunder stood as a defining moment for the game, pushing the boundaries of what a raid could be. With patch 5.2, Blizzard raised the bar. Visually, mechanically, and thematically, it was Mists of Pandaria at its boldest. Throne of Thunder felt like a fusion of Ulduar and Zul'Aman, blending the best of both. Jinrock the Breaker kicked things off, and honestly, solid opener. Straightforward, but punchy. You had him tossing players into the walls, leaving behind these conductive water pools that were both a blessing and a curse, boosting your damage but making you more vulnerable at the same time. Add in fixating lightning orbs and the usual environmental chaos, and it didn't take long for things to spiral if your group wasn't paying attention. It was a clean introduction to the raid, simple mechanics that ramped up fast. If Jinrock eased you in, Horadon slammed the door behind you. This was the real wall for early progression, a massive armoured dino backed by waves of trollads from every tribe imaginable. The whole fight felt more like a gauntlet than a traditional boss. It punished sloppy execution, hard. A lot of groups never made it past him in the first week. The damage stacked up fast, tanks were under constant pressure, and between the waves of trolls, Direhorn Spirits and War God Jalak showed up late to the party. It was very easy to get overwhelmed. For the lucky few, Horadon also dropped the spawn of Horadon. Council of Elders was pretty crazy. 4 bosses, all with their own mechanics, frost orbs, sand traps, shadow spirits flying around, and the whole time they're rotating through these empowered phases that crank everything up. It was one of those fights where your group had to constantly shift focus, stay alert, and just survive the madness. It wasn't the cleanest fight, but it definitely kept you on your toes. Just before Torto's, beneath the bridge following the Council of Elders, was one of Mists of Pandaria's cheekiest secrets. If you dropped down into a small ring of geysers, you could trigger a hidden objective, bounce between them to build stacks of a buff. If you managed to rack up 250 stacks without interruption, you'd receive a letter from Taoshi, along with a ridiculous reward, the Shadowpan Geyser Gun. It's a toy water gun, that's it. You spray your friends, you spray their pets, you get 5 minutes of pure aquatic chaos. It's short-ranged, it makes a silly sound, and has absolutely zero combat value, but is absolutely worth it. Go and get it. Getting back to the bosses, it was Torto's where the raid really started to feel fun for me. The fight's central mechanic, kicking giant turtle shells into cave bats and interrupting his shatter, was chaotic, satisfying, and genuinely creative. I can still remember one of my guildmates who loved kicking the shells. He'd line them up like a free kick and shout over TeamSpeak that he was David Beckham, just, maybe with slightly less finesse than Beck's himself. But that's what made Torto's special. Silly moments, shared roles, and just enough chaos to spark real memories. You had to juggle bats, interrupts, and those flying shells, turning it into a fun, frantic challenge that actually felt different. So how do you say this boss's name? Majira? I'm going to say Majira, and Majira was a Hydra with a twist. Rather than a single boss with set phases, the whole fight revolved around repeatedly slaying her heads, and every time you did, the chaos ramped up. You picked the order, but every head that fell made the next more dangerous, until the arena was just a flooded mess of overlapping mechanics. Acid torrents, freezing beams, fire trails, it all punished bad positioning. It wasn't that crazy a fight, and I actually really liked it. It was really good fun to heal. The path to Ji-kun was interesting. If you played Throne, then I'm sure you remember these guys well. Giant snails in the tunnel. Deceptively slow, but fully capable of one-shotting anyone not paying attention. Ji-kun was easily one of the most inventive encounters in the raid, I thought. Set in this huge open chamber with platforms and updrafts, the whole fight revolved around gliding between nests to intercept her eggs before they hatched. The central mechanic had you kicking food globules around to stop the eggs from hatching and prevent feed pools from forming. Meanwhile, some players were flying, others were stuck on the ground dodging acid puddles, healing through quills, and trying not to get shoved off the platform by downdrafts. And if you were lucky, she could also drop a mount. Darumu the Forgotten definitely lived up to his name, a fight so confusing and chaotic that some players have probably blocked it out. The standout moment was the disintegration beam, a rotating death ray slicing through the room while you scramble to find these narrow safe spots. One wrong step, instant death. And if your graphics were turned down or the pattern wasn't clear, well, it felt less like a mechanic and more like a death lottery. You also had the colour phase. Red, blue and yellow spotlights you had to aim perfectly to reveal invisible adds. If you missed one, they'd power up and wipe the raid. It was ambitious, but in reality, it needed flawless coordination and crystal clear visuals, which most groups didn't have. Darumu wasn't bugged, but the fight felt that way sometimes. It demanded precision, but gave you little clarity, on top of healing pressure, debuff management, and constant visual overload. It's no surprise he was one of the hardest bosses of the tier. Primordius was one of the weirder fights in Throne of Thunder. Instead of just pumping out damage, players had to evolve mid-fight by soaking red mutated pools dropped by the adds. Each pool brought you closer to full mutation, and once you were fully evolved, your abilities hit like a truck. I thought it was really cool. It was definitely something different. Dark Animus was one of the more complex and controversial fights in Throne of Thunder. It wasn't hard to see why. Between the weird mechanics, the sheer number of adds, and all the things your group had to juggle at once, it got overwhelming fast. The whole fight revolved around managing anima golems, each with their own energy levels, while Dark Animus itself slowly powered up in the background. You had to carefully transfer anima, keep the golems from linking together, dodge rings of death, and all the while, that big red construct just kept getting stronger. For a lot of guilds, this fight was a massive wall. For me, if you can't tell, I hated it. Absolutely hated it. It was always a miserable experience, just an annoying, fiddly mess. Ironquon, I think that's how you say it, was one of the more fun fights in Throne of Thunder. The whole thing played out like a multi-phase gauntlet as you faced off against Ironquon and his Quillen mounts, each one bringing their own set of mechanics to the fight. Fire, frost, lightning. You'd be dodging walls of fire, soaked in storms. It was brutal for sure, but I always thought it was a great fight. Fast-paced, chaotic, but still fun, and each phase kept things fresh. The Twin Empyreans, originally known as the Twin Consorts, were one of my favourite fights in Throne of Thunder. The whole fight revolved around night and day phases, switching between Lulin and Suen, each bringing their own set of mechanics to the table. At night, you were dealing with sleep effects, shadow beasts, and arcane damage. Then suddenly it's day, and you're dodging fire while Suen ramps up the heat. And during the dusk phase, they fight together for a final push. What I really liked though was the Celestial Aid, calling on the powers of the August Celestials mid-fight to help your group. Depending on which Celestial answered your call, you get different buffs. Bonus healing, damage reduction, movement speed, little boosts that made a real difference, and added some extra strategy to the fight. Most players I raided with enjoyed this one. Not the hardest fight, but a great prelude to Lei Shen. Lei Shen, the Thunder King. An original villain that somehow managed to sit alongside Warcraft's biggest names, and honestly, this fight lived up to the hype, I think. The whole encounter revolved around the lightning conduits, power sources scattered around the room, that charged up as the fight went on. Depending on how your group handled them, Lei Shen's abilities got nastier. Phase after phase the pressure built, weaving through lightning strikes, dealing with adds, and the platform itself trying to throw you off. Beating Lei Shen was a big moment for me and my guild. It was a great experience. That said, I know some players walked away underwhelmed. Not because of the fight itself necessarily, but because for a lot of people, Lei Shen just wasn't a name they recognised. If you weren't paying attention to the lore, or didn't follow the Pandaria story closely, he lacked that immediate, iconic impact you'd get from bosses like Arthas or Deathwing. I thought Blizzard nailed it. A mechanically brilliant fight, wrapped around a villain who, at least for me, earned his place in Warcraft's history. More on Lei Shen later in the video. But of course, there's one more challenge. The secret boss Ra-Den on heroic mode. Only accessible through beating Lei Shen, this boss had a limit of 30 attempts per week. Sadly, I don't feel super qualified to talk about Ra-Den as I never got the chance to beat this fight, but the idea of a secret boss was so cool to me, and at the time, I remember it being a really big deal. For a raid built entirely around Pandaria's lore, without leaning on legacy characters, Throne of Thunder really punched above its weight. Even now, I feel like it doesn't always get the credit it deserves. I'll admit, the group I was playing with at the time definitely added to the fun, but the raid itself had some amazing fights, cool mechanics, and moments that I'll always remember fondly. And finally, Siege of Orgrimmar, the crescendo of the Mists of Pandaria story. A raid that had the weight of the entire Horde vs Alliance conflict riding on it. There was something so cool about this being the raid. It was the Horde's capital, but now as an enemy, it felt different, even from an Alliance point of view. It had the same sort of gravitas as something like Icecrown Citadel, at least for me anyway. We begin with Immersive, who is a bit of a weird one. You walk into this huge dramatic chamber, see this massive corrupted water elemental, and think, oh yeah, here we go. Siege is kicking off strong. But the fight, bit of a snooze fest. It was basically a big blob that slowly melted apart into smaller blobs. Some you healed, some you killed. And then he reformed and you did it all over again. To be fair, on Heroic, the fight was tuned a bit tighter, but for most players, this was just a slow, drawn-out intro boss. Not awful, not memorable. The Fallen Protectors, yeah, this one was there. That's probably the best way to describe it. You're thrown into this fight against 3 corrupted Pandaren, He, Sun, and Rook, and it should have felt like a cool character-driven encounter. Pandaren lore, inner darkness, all that stuff. But in reality, it just felt like a council fight that dragged on a bit too long. Mechanically, it wasn't even that complicated. You just had to keep their health roughly even and deal with their little phases when they dropped low. But between the ads, the awkward timings, and the general lack of excitement, it kind of ended up as filler content before the raid really got going. I don't hate this fight by any means, but I also don't remember thinking, ooh, I can't wait to get to Fallen Protectors tonight. It existed, it dropped loot, we moved on. I liked this fight, even though technically we weren't even fighting him. The whole idea here was managing your corruption meter, sending players into little solo challenges to purify themselves before rejoining the fight. It was a good concept. DPS, healers, tanks, everyone had their own trial to pass, and if you messed it up, the corruption flooded the room and things got ugly fast. It wasn't the hardest fight, but I'll give Blizzard credit, it was a creative way to mix personal responsibility with the bigger raid mechanics, and it tied nicely into the whole corruption theme of the expansion. This was where Siege really kicked off for me. The first few bosses, fine, but Shah of Pride, that's when it started to feel like we were really in the thick of it. Mechanically, it was solid. The Pride system made every little mistake feel dangerous. Your Pride stacked up over time, and the higher it got, the nastier things became. Explosions, mind controls, the usual Blizzard, you've messed up, now suffer. I also loved the little Pac-Man moment in this fight, darting around collecting orbs trying to avoid the Shah. It was simple, but fun. The cool thing about Mogu'shan hanging around was that he would occasionally bail you out, purifying people and resetting their pride, but if you slipped up too much, the fight could snowball fast. Once you got the boss low enough, it properly escalated. Mogu'shan gets one shot, the boss goes full rage mode, and the room just descends into chaos. I would maybe describe Shah of Pride as divisive, but I really enjoyed it. I love fights where we have to manage gauges, meters, or other similar mechanics, so Shah of Pride was pretty great for me. It was thematically strong, with mechanics that kept you on your toes, and a satisfying way to wrap up the corruption arc of Pandaria before we kicked down the gates of Orgrimmar. I'm not sure many people have fond memories of this fight. I certainly don't. It should have been exciting. You're finally out in Durotar, the siege is properly underway, the city's right there, and then you're stuck in this drawn out fight that just kind of drags. The whole thing boiled down to clearing waves of adds, sending teams up the towers, and waiting around until the anti-air turrets were ready to knock Galakras out of the sky. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the dragon finally lands and you finish the job. The second phase, actually fighting Galakras, wasn't awful, but by that point, most of the excitement had been drained out of the encounter. It wasn't a disaster of a fight, but it definitely felt like a roadblock more than a highlight. The moment I saw Durotar and the gates of Orgrimmar, that was exciting. Galakras, not so much. Iron Juggernaut was a big mechanical scorpion parked outside the gates. He looked very cool. The fight itself, it was okay. Lots of dodging, explosions everywhere, landmines rolling around the place. It felt more like you were fighting the area than the boss half the time. Iron Juggernaut had two phases. Assault mode where it stomped around, and Siege mode where it dug in and flooded the area with even more hazards. It wasn't overly complicated, but it got repetitive fast. Similarly to Galakras, I was just happy to be getting through it and finally pushing into the city. The fight itself, not a standout for me, but it was fine. On paper, this should have been one of the coolest fights in Siege of Orgrimmar. You've got these two hulking shamans corrupted by Garrosh's madness, chucking toxic sludge, tornadoes, and general elemental chaos all over the place. It sounds great. It should have been great. The mechanics were basically dodge the endless swirl of garbage on the floor, try not to get cornered by tornadoes, and pray your healers are paying attention. It wasn't that it was hard, it was just ugly. Visually chaotic, mechanically bland, and borderline annoying. If you raided this at the time, you'll remember that most groups didn't even fight the bosses in their actual room. You'd pull them halfway down the street in front of Orgrimmar, kite them around the block, and do the whole fight out in the open. That tells you everything you need to know about how this encounter played. The only real tension was making sure your group didn't accidentally pull a bunch of random trash mobs. Other than that, just another underwhelming checkpoint on the way to Garrosh. I say that Siege is probably in my top 5, but there was definitely some disappointing encounters, and I'm sad to say this was another one of them for me. Before we get to General Nazgrim, there's something we need to talk about. You know what it is. You know why you're here. A quick shout out to what might be the true highlight of Siege of Orgrimmar, saving Gammon. I don't care how many bosses you've downed, how heroic your progression was, nothing felt better than marching into Orgrimmar, cutting through Garrosh's corrupted forces, and freeing our boy Gammon. We found him, locked up, battered, humiliated, and we were the ones who set him free. Watching him rise up, enraged, and ready to throw hands was a beautiful thing. Gammon would lead us on a crusade through Ragefire Chasm, and I thought it was so cool they made it part of the raid. And then we faced General Nazgrim, which sadly wasn't so cool. This fight isn't going to top anyone's most exciting encounters list, but it deserves respect. Nazgrim's been around for ages. He's one of those Horde characters who always showed up in the background. Loyal, reliable, and unfortunately for him, completely stuck under Garrosh's command when the siege kicks off. The fight itself, pretty bog standard, but it had that classic pug killer mechanic baked in, defensive stance. Basically, if you kept hitting him during that, you were just handing him free rage, and the more rage he built, the more brutal his abilities got. From big shockwaves to banners that pumped his power, and of course, that lovely warsong scream that chunked everyone's health. It wasn't the flashiest encounter in the world, but I've always appreciated what it represented. Nazgrim wasn't some power-hungry villain or corrupted abomination. He was a soldier, loyal to a fault. Even when the walls of Orgrimmar were burning around him, he stood his ground, followed his orders, and paid the price for it. You couldn't help but feel a bit bad cutting him down, but at the end of the day, he made his choice. This is where the raid started to feel properly grim. With Malkorok, you finally came face to face with the raw, nasty side of Garrosh's power. His right-hand brute completely juiced up on Old God energy. They absolutely nailed the atmosphere of this fight for me. The arena was dark, oppressive, swirling with corruption. The boss, pure muscle, pure rage, completely loyal to Garrosh. It looked and felt like things were escalating. The fight itself, though, bit of a mixed bag. This fight was tricky for me as a healer. The big gimmick was Ancient Miasma, where your normal health bar gets replaced by an absorb shield, so healers couldn't just top you off like usual. They had to constantly rebuild that shield. Once it broke, you were basically one mistake away from being flattened. The floor was constantly covered in swirling zones that exploded if you stood in them, and every so often, Malkorok would slam the ground, sending players flying if they weren't paying attention. It wasn't bad, to be fair. The absorb mechanic was a cool idea, and on progression, the fight actually felt like a decent challenge, especially for your healers. But after a few weeks of farm, it started to drag. Spoils of Pandaria. Christ. I feel like most people watching will expect my first words on this fight to be, what a pile of crap. Definitely one of the raid's lowest points, and if you've watched my past retrospectives, you'll know how excited I get when it comes to splitting up the raid groups, but this just wasn't great. It felt lazy. The whole encounter takes place inside this big storage room full of crates hoarded from across Pandaria. The raid splits in half, with one group going left and the other going right. Each side works their way through waves of mobs by opening crates and dealing with whatever pops out. The goal? Open enough crates, kill enough mobs, and max out this gauge so you can pull the lever. When both groups finish their side, you move on to the next room, and do it all over again. Rinse and repeat, baby. The most buzz I got from this fight is knowing we'd finished our side first. This was just disappointing and very uninspiring. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be trapped in a prison with an enraged, corrupted dinosaur while your entire raid slowly descends into panic, welcome to Thok. The moment you walk into that cell block and see him chained up, you know it's going to be one of those fights, and sure enough, it's pure stress from start to finish. The whole encounter basically revolved around deafening screech. Thok would let out this horrible shriek that hits harder and harder the longer the phase goes on, and if your timing wasn't perfect, it would just straight up flatten your raid. Then, once the scent of blood got to him, blood frenzy kicked in. At that point, all strategy is out the window. He'd break loose, go full Jurassic Park, and start chasing people down. If he caught you, game over. And of course, during all of this, you had to break into cages around the room and free prisoners to help deal with him. Depending on which prisoner gets eaten, he'd absorb a different elemental ability. Is this fight memorable? Absolutely. Is it fun? That depends entirely on your group's pain tolerance. Black Fuse is awesome. A lot of people will tell you that. Most would probably tell you it's the jewel in the crown for Siege. Some say it's overrated, and I kind of get that by today's standards, but at the time, Black Fuse was good. Really good. This wasn't your standard boss in the middle of the room encounter. Black Fuse turned the whole fight into organised chaos. You had ads flooding in, and players getting flung onto conveyor belts to destroy priority targets. Mechanically, it was very clever. The belt team had real responsibility. Mess that up, and suddenly your raid's getting melted by lasers or blown apart by mines. It was one of those fights where every role had something important to deal with, and everything felt connected. Was it a bit much? For its time, maybe? Is it overhyped nowadays? That's probably fair to say. But for its time, Black Fuse was genuinely impressive. The Klaxi Paragons should have been huge. The Klaxi were built up across the whole expansion. You spend all of Dread Wastes awakening these guys, working with them, and for the most part, they're on your side. Sort of. So when they show up in Siege of Orgrimmar, that should have been a massive moment. The betrayal, the lore payoff, the realisation that they were never fighting for Pandaria, they were fighting for their empire, and the old gods were part of that plan all along. My problem with this fight, it just wasn't that special. Mechanically, it was a bit of a mess. You always had 3 paragons active at a time, and every time you killed one, another would jump in to take their place. Each paragon had their own weird little gimmick, so unless you were raiding at a high level, most of your group barely understood half of what was happening at any given moment. It wasn't terrible, but it definitely felt like a letdown considering how much potential the Klaxi had as characters. Blizzard had all these cool designs, great voice acting, a rich little subplot, and it just sort of fizzled into a forgettable pre-Garrosh roadblock. The Klaxi deserved better. 13 bosses later, we finally made it. Garrosh Hellscream. The final boss. The big one. But before the fight even starts, you've got to go through the weekly ritual, the Thrall RP. I thought this was great. Once. It fast turned into background noise. You'd zone out, Alt-Tab, make a drink. It was a staple of the Siege experience. As for the fight itself, I really liked it. It was long, it was intense, it dragged on forever by the time you were progressing it, but that's what final bosses should be. You start off in the throne room fighting Garrosh and his Kor'kron troops, with siege engineers trying to fire off Iron Stars. If you timed them right, they were basically giant murder pinballs flying across the room. It was really cool getting pulled into the realms of Y'Shaarj, corrupted visions of Pandaria warped by Shah energy. Fighting your way through those twisted memories while Garrosh tried to drain more power from the heart was a great touch. And then of course, Phase 3. This is when Garrosh fully embraces the old god corruption. The room warps, the abilities get nastier, and suddenly, it's just pure chaos. Empowered mind control spreading throughout the raid, those desecrated weapons choking up the floor, it's a proper final stretch. But if you were raiding on Heroic, what we'd now call Mythic, there was one more surprise waiting. Phase 4. The moment Garrosh hits 10% health, the stage transitions, and suddenly you're fighting him in a corrupted version of Stormwind City. As an Alliance player, that was something. Seeing Stormwind completely twisted by Shah corruption was both awesome and horrifying. I still think it's a very slept-on transition. I still have the screenshot of our very first kill on Garrosh, just ignore the fact I'm playing Horde in it. We really don't need to talk about that. Was Garrosh perfect? No. Did it drag? Yes. But as a final boss to wrap up Mists of Pandaria and Siege, it delivered. As a raid, Siege did exactly what it set out to do. It was big, it was ambitious, and it actually felt like you were part of a siege, tearing through the city, storming the gates, and finally facing off with Garrosh. It delivered on scale, atmosphere, and story payoff. Not every fight was a hit, obviously. Spoils, Klaxi, Galacrest dragged it down quite a bit, but there were standout moments too. Blackfuse was a proper raid check, Thok was chaos incarnate, and the final phase with Garrosh and a corrupted Stormwind, I loved it. Was it the best final raid that WoW has ever seen? No. But for me, I think it has the same emotional weight and gravitas as an Icecrown Citadel, and as a conclusion to Pandaria's story, as a proper send-off to an expansion full of surprises, yeah, it worked. Thunderforging was introduced in Mists of Pandaria, specifically tied to the Throne of Thunder raid. Thunderforged loot was a rare bonus added to normal and heroic items, increasing their item level by 6. For example, normal mode loot would drop at 522, but if it was Thunderforged, it would jump to 528. Heroic loot had a similar boost, with items going from 535 to 541. The idea behind it was simple: make loot feel exciting, offer a sense of progression beyond just item level, and give that extra wow factor when you saw your gear had been Thunderforged. Some would say this added an exciting element to loot, that possibility of getting a slightly better version of your gear, keeping the grind rewarding without feeling overwhelming. But the system didn't stop there. It continued in Siege of Orgrimmar where Warforging was introduced, and by the time Legion rolled around with Titanforging, it was crazy. That's when it started to feel like the carrot on a stick loot chase went a bit too far. I have a chapter dedicated to this in my Legion video, which you can click somewhere on the screen if you're interested, but the long and short of it is, while Mists of Pandaria felt more manageable with Thunderforging, by the time Legion and BFA were here, it felt like the hunt for best in slot gear was never ending. You could get lucky and have gear Warforge or Titanforge, but sometimes you'd get nothing. It became frustrating, and for me, it was a classic case of, well, you're never going to be done, because loot could always roll higher. We had a few items introduced that added a bit of extra excitement to the loot grind. The Elder Charm of Good Fortune, Mogu Rune of Fate, and Warforged Seal. These essentially all worked the same way, but just for different raid tiers. You'd use the charm, and if you were lucky, you'd get an additional spec-specific item from the boss's loot table. If not, you just get some gold instead. I didn't hate the coin rolling aspect. I thought it was fine. It wasn't too crazy like what Titanforging became. It added a fun element of surprise and a little reward for the time invested in raiding. But the introduction of both coin rolling and Thunderforging really showcased a shift in both raid design and reward systems, one that changed the way Blizzard experienced loot progression, and one that Blizzard have certainly dialed back in recent years. To wrap up, the first 3 raids were fine in their own right. They provided decent, solid content and felt like a good setup for what was to come. But when it came to Throne of Thunder and Siege of Orgrimmar, those were the raids that truly stood out for me, as I'm sure they did for everybody. They were just levels above. They were brilliant experiences with well-crafted mechanics and memorable bosses. I rate both of these raids very highly. As much as I love Siege of Orgrimmar, it wasn't perfect, and there's one thing, or rather one number, that sadly holds it back. As much praise as Mists of Pandaria deserves, it's impossible to ignore the loudest noise, and for me, that was Siege of Orgrimmar lasting 13 months. For over a year, players were stuck in the same raid tier, running the same bosses, with no new content on the horizon. It remains the longest content drought in World of Warcraft history, and that left a mark. At the time, this felt like a breaking point for many players. Subscriptions dropped, guilds fell apart, burnout was rampant. Many players unsubscribed. Others re-rolled alts, dabbled in PvP, or just logged in and out of habit. It didn't matter how good Siege was, and it was a well-designed raid. Thematically rich, mechanically varied, and narratively satisfying, but even the best raid can become a prison when it's all you've got for over a year. In some ways, I think it soured the final impression of Mists of Pandaria, which up to that point had delivered content at a strong, steady pace, and I think every expansion has its air quotes hate landmark, that one thing that players latch onto when they look back. When you think of Warlords, you think of Garrisons, BFA you think of Azerite gear or the grind, Shadowlands you think of, well, take your pick. But for Mists, that landmark became Siege, not because of its design, but because of its duration. That's what makes the expansion's legacy feel so complicated in hindsight. People often remember the Burnout more than the brilliant rollout of content that came before. Mists had one of the most consistent content cadences in WoW's history, until the very end. That sudden silence created a sense of abandonment that carried over into Warlords of Draenor. By the time Warlords launched, players were desperate for something new. That anticipation helped it explode straight out of the gate, but it also meant it had even further to fall when things didn't live up to the hype. Even Blizzard later acknowledged that the Siege drought was a misstep. It's a firm reminder that even a great expansion can be overshadowed by how it finishes, and for Mists, the final chapter just lasted far too long. While Mythic difficulty wouldn't officially launch until Warlords of Draenor, the seeds of raiding's evolution were planted in Mists of Pandaria. Patch 5.4 introduced a groundbreaking new concept, flexible raiding. Unlike the rigid 10 or 25 player format of normal and heroic, flex mode scaled dynamically based on group size, anywhere from 10 to 25 players. This would later become 30 players. It meant more freedom. You could bring who you had, not who you were supposed to have. For friends, guilds, and family groups, this was revolutionary. It was a sign that Blizzard understood not every raid team fit neatly into strict boxes, but not every change to raiding landed quite so smoothly. Looking for Raid, or LFR, was in full force by this point, giving casual players access to raid content they'd never been able to experience before, and for many, that was amazing. You could queue up, see the story, earn loot, and feel like you were part of the expansion's big moments. But LFR also came with a cost. It diluted the sense of accomplishment that raiding once carried, turning what used to be epic, hard-fought battles into something that felt more like a tourist mode. The fights were easier, coordination was minimal, and behaviour often broke down into toxic chat or players just going AFK. To some, it made raids more accessible. To others, it made them feel disposable. LFR wasn't a disaster, far from it, but it introduced a cultural shift in how players engaged with endgame content, one that we're still feeling today. Then came the next shift. The rigid structure of 10 and 25 caused endless balance headaches. Bosses could feel wildly different depending on your raid size. Flex raiding in patch 5.4 had already shown there was a better way. Blizzard wanted consistency at the top end, and with Mythic, they introduced a single, fixed 20-player format. While Siege wasn't originally designed for Mythic, it was retrofitted with the new structure, giving players an early taste of what was to come. It wasn't just a mechanical shift, it was a cultural one. Raiding suddenly became more organised, more demanding, and for many, more exclusive. For tight-knit 10-man guilds, Mythic felt like a death sentence. You either doubled your roster or fell behind, and a lot of groups, sadly, didn't survive that jump. Even today, there's a devoted crowd that argue Cataclysm and Mists offered the best raid experience thanks to 10-man Heroic. Myself included, I still quietly hope for an introduction to 10-man Mythic someday. Mythic didn't just change how raids were tuned, it reshaped how guilds operated, how rosters were built, and how the world-first race evolved into a global spectacle. Raiding became more accessible and more refined, but also more fragmented. For some, the soul of those tight-knit 10-man runs never truly returned. Siege of Orgrimmar didn't just close the curtain on Mists of Pandaria, it closed the chapter on a more intimate era of raiding. The Timeless Isle was one of the most revolutionary zones Blizzard had ever designed. Unlike traditional endgame areas built around daily quests or structured storylines, the Isle was intentionally unstructured. A sandbox of secrets, rare spawns, elite creatures, and jumping puzzles. There were no quest hubs guiding your every move. Instead, it encouraged players to explore freely, stumble into bosses, group up on the fly, and discover its secrets at their own pace. It was completely non-linear. You didn't arrive with a checklist, you arrived with curiosity. Players hunted down treasure chests scattered across the island, challenged world bosses like the Celestials and Ordos, and scoured the jungle for rare spawns that offered hefty rewards. One of the most famous was Hulon, a shadowy black cloud serpent who patrolled the upper walkways of the island. He became a legend among mount hunters, with players camping his spawn for hours at a time, hoping for the rare drop, the thundering onyx cloud serpent. In the central courtyard of the island, players could face off against the 4 August Celestials in a rotating set of encounters, powerful world bosses that rewarded high-end loot and added a sense of ritual to the Isle's weekly reset rhythm. Ordos in particular stood out, not just for his imposing presence as a lost Yongle fire god, but because he was locked behind the legendary Cloak questline. Only players who had completed that long journey could even step into his domain, making him one of WoW's few bosses gated behind true personal achievement. Certain treasures, like the elusive blazing chest, were locked behind challenging gauntlets or timed puzzles, rewarding not just curiosity, but mastery of the island's layout. The shared tag system on elites and bosses made grouping effortless, and there was a constant sense of emergent gameplay. Players pinging map locations in chat, forming groups on the fly, and coming together organically. It was a living, breathing world, and it worked beautifully. The primary reward system came through timeless coins, a currency that could be used to purchase gear, vanity items, and powerful account-bound tokens. These timeless gear pieces made the zone incredibly alt-friendly, a perfect catch-up system that didn't feel mindless. You could gear multiple characters just by exploring. You also couldn't fly here, and that was no accident. Blizzard wanted you to walk, to engage, to be pulled into events instead of flying over them, and it worked. The terrain was layered, filled with hidden areas like the Cavern of Lost Spirits, the Orden Sanctuary, or the eerie underwater pits. After the heavily structured dailies of the Shadow Pan, the Golden Lotus, and everything else, the Timeless Isle felt like a breath of fresh air. Less grind, more discovery. And for those seeking even more danger, the Center of Eternal Agony allowed players to turn on each other for bloody coins, creating unexpected PvP encounters even on otherwise peaceful servers. Suddenly, the Isle wasn't just about exploring, it was about watching your back. And then, of course, there were the frogs. Tucked away on the southeastern shores of the Isle, players discovered a dense cluster of elite frogs. They weren't glamorous, but they were efficient, dropping timeless coins, BOEs, and reputation items in bulk. It didn't take long for players to realise that with enough AoE, these frogs became a goldmine. And so began the age of frog farming. An unintentional but wildly popular grind that turned into a social activity of its own. Players would group up, mow down waves of frogs, and joke endlessly about it. It wasn't something Blizzard planned, but that was the beauty of the Timeless Isle. It allowed players to make their own goals, their own fun, and sometimes that fun just happened to be frogs. And then, my favourite part, there was the spirit of Emperor Xiaohao. At the heart of the Timeless Isle, his essence lingered. As mentioned earlier, through a series of stunning animated shorts, Xiaohao's journey unfolds before us. These cinematics tell the story of his personal transformation, how he overcame fear, doubt, anger and pride, ultimately becoming the mist that shielded Pandaria from the outside world. These moments were powerful, poetic, and they provided the expansion with a rare moment of introspection in its final chapter. His story, like the Isle itself, invited us to reflect. And just next door, the Celestial Tournament, a brutal gauntlet for pet battlers which was covered earlier in the Pet Battles chapter. To sum up the Timeless Isle, it was an experiment in freedom. It trusted the player to make their own fun, and that trust helped inspire many of World of Warcraft's future open world designs. Its DNA can still be felt in zones such as Tanaan Jungle, the Broken Shore, Argus, Mechagon, Zereth Mortis, each borrowing pieces of that unstructured brilliance. I like to finish up these retrospectives with the villains, and I think Shen absolutely deserves his own chapter, and here's why. He wasn't a throwback, a corrupted hero, or a fan favourite brought back from the dead for nostalgia's sake. Shen was something else entirely. He was original. In a game filled with demons and dragons, Shen stood out, not as a cosmic threat, but as a man, a mortal who dared to steal the power of the Titans and reshape the world in his image. He wasn't gifted with strength, he took it. By force, by ambition, by sheer unrelenting will. That's what made him terrifying, and believable. Long before Garrosh or Sylvanas ever flirted with ultimate power, Shen had already claimed it. He defeated Ra-Den the Titan Keeper and used his knowledge to build an empire, not just through conquest, but through infrastructure, through control, through fear. He wasn't some mad tyrant ranting about chaos or vengeance. He believed in order, in a structured, obedient world where he alone decided what was right, and for a time, it worked. The Mogu Empire flourished, roads were built, laws were enforced, rebellions were crushed. The Isle of Thunder told his story piece by piece, through scrolls, ruins, cutscenes, and chose narration, and the more you learned, the more chilling he became. This wasn't a villain we were told to hate, he was a villain that we understood, and that's what made him great. The entire raid was his legacy, a storm-choked tomb built on dominance. Every encounter echoed his philosophy, brutality, discipline, obedience. What I love most is that Shen wasn't a one-note tyrant. Similarly to Garrosh, he wasn't corrupted, he wasn't being manipulated, he chose this path, and in that way, he was the perfect villain for Pandaria. A continent defined by internal struggle, emotional imbalance, and the consequences of unchecked power. But even in death, he left his mark. Through Ra-Den, through the secrets beneath the island, through the whispers of the Titans, his shadow stretched far beyond the grave. In many ways, he was the first real taste of the cosmic scale that would shape future expansions like Legion and Shadowlands, and he did it all without ever being a household name. Blizzard deserve a ton of credit here. They created someone new, someone original, and they made him matter. No fan nostalgia, no callbacks, just bold storytelling, clever design, and the courage to let a villain stand on his own. Shen didn't need a legacy to start with. He built one. Before diving into Garrosh's role in Mists of Pandaria, it's worth a quick nod to his roots. Introduced during the Burning Crusade as Garrosh Hellscream's son, Garrosh was shaped by a legacy of strength, honour, and crucially, the trauma of his father's sacrifice. Whilst his earlier appearances hinted at a brash and hot-headed warrior, it's in Mists of Pandaria where Garrosh truly becomes a fully realised character, one who's both tragic and terrifying. What's great about Garrosh, and why he's such an unforgettable villain to me, is that he's not your usual corrupted bad guy. No green fell magic, no old god whispers, no burning legion brainwashing. Garrosh's downfall comes from his own stubbornness. He truly believes in his version of strength and honour, even when it's clearly flawed, and that's what makes him human. He's not evil for the sake of evil, he's acting out of loyalty and what he thinks is duty, and that's terrifying because it's so relatable. However, his story isn't just about Garrosh himself, it's also about the environment that shaped him and the people around him, especially Thrall. As his mentor and former war chief, Thrall's inability to see the warning signs and his sometimes naive hope for Garrosh's leadership bear some of the blame for the chaos that followed. This complexity adds layers to Garrosh's character, showing that his downfall was not purely personal, but also a failure of those who guided him. He also stands in sharp contrast to other Horde leaders like Vol'jin and Bane, leaders who sought strength through unity and understanding. Where they believed in cooperation, Garrosh believed peace was weakness. That ideological clash positioned him as a living contradiction within the Horde itself. One of the most striking contradictions in Garrosh's story comes with his decision to wield the Heart of Y'Shaarj and draw upon the power of the Shah, dark forces he had openly despised earlier in his journey. This moment really feels like a breaking point, where his rigid code of honour gives way to a desperate and dangerous pragmatism. Rather than a simple betrayal of his beliefs, it's more a tragic irony. Garrosh, convinced that only overwhelming strength can protect the Horde, chooses a path that ultimately destroys both himself and much of what he claimed to stand for. This clash between his past convictions and his later actions adds another layer to his character, showing how even the strongest ideals can falter under the weight of ambition and fear. Garrosh wasn't simply a brute with a chip on his shoulder. He was a leader with a twisted ideal. He believed that the Horde's survival depended on strength above all else, strength achieved through unity and sometimes ruthless purity. His vision rejected diplomacy and compromise in favour of dominance, which alienated many allies and sowed discord both within and outside the Horde. This complex mix of conviction and cruelty adds depth to his character, showing how leadership can be corrupted by rigid ideology. Even after his defeat, Garrosh's story wasn't finished. He escaped into the alternate timeline, setting the stage for Warlords of Draenor, where his ambitions and violent ways would finally come to a grim conclusion. The Iron Horde wasn't just another army, it was Garrosh's dream made flesh, a horde untainted, unyielding, and unquestioning. It was the final, brutal expression of his ideology, and its final undoing. In many ways, the Horde never fully recovered from Garrosh. His reign set off a chain of internal soul-searching that would haunt it for expansions to come. Ultimately, Garrosh's legacy is one of caution and tragedy. He embodies the dangers of unwavering pride and the cost of blind loyalty to one's ideals. His story serves as a powerful reminder that strength without wisdom can lead to destruction, and that leadership demands both conviction and humility. Even after his defeat, his impact on the Horde and Azeroth remains undeniable, making him one of the most memorable and nuanced villains in World of Warcraft history. When I think about this expansion, it reminds me a bit of the Star Wars prequels. They were mocked and ridiculed when they first came out, but over time, they found a loving fanbase, and I think WoW Remix did an amazing job reconnecting us with that nostalgia. I really hope anyone trying out Mists of Pandaria Classic, whether returning or maybe discovering it for the first time, falls in love with it. Mists of Pandaria asked something different of us. It slowed down, it encouraged reflection, and when it hit hard, it really hit. Garrosh wasn't just a villain. He was a reflection of what unchecked pride and power can become, a mirror to the factions themselves. His downfall wasn't just a Horde reckoning, it was the culmination of everything Pandaria tried to warn us about. Mists of Pandaria taught us that sometimes the most epic battles are the ones within. It took risks, it changed the formula, and it left a lasting mark on WoW's story and gameplay. This expansion also laid the groundwork for many systems that we take for granted today, from challenge modes that evolved into Mythic Plus, to scenario-based storytelling, to experimental endgame zones like the Timeless Isle. It was a time of bold risks, and most of them paid off. And looking back now, with Mists of Pandaria Classic on the horizon, we can see it for what it truly was. A bold chapter that defied expectation. A tale that began as a meme, and became a masterpiece. Of course, this is just my perspective. You may share it or see things differently, and that's great. These videos are made for discussion, entertainment, and opinion. So what are your memories of Mists of Pandaria? Whether you loved it or hated it, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. If you're interested in more retrospectives, there should be a playlist for you to click somewhere on the screen. A big thank you to my amazing patrons for supporting the channel. Your encouragement helps me keep making these videos. If you'd like to support the channel, the link to my Patreon is in the description below. And of course, a big thank you to you as well for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.